Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. I will tell you about the events of 2012 which took place near Denver. I invite you to listen to the story of Harold Henthorn and Toni Henthorn. But first, let's move to the city of Jackson, Mississippi, where in 1999, Harold Henthorn met 37-year-old Toni Bertelize. Toni was born in 1962 and, along with her two brothers, grew up in a loving family whose parents tried to teach their children Christian values. She was a very intelligent girl and never had any problems at school. She was also a very ambitious person and did not want to just benefit from the money of her parents, who were well off. She wanted to achieve something in life herself, and since she also associated her future with helping other people, she decided to apply to medical school and become an ophthalmologist. Quite early by today's standards, at the age of 24, Toni got married. The marriage ended in divorce, which Toni considered a personal failure. She then threw herself into work and began to become increasingly successful in this field. She became co-owner of an eye clinic, which she also worked as an eye surgeon. She tried to do her job to the best of her ability, which resulted in her being awarded one of the best ophthalmologists in America in 2006. But before that happened, in 1999, Toni decided to use the internet as a way to meet a man with whom she could perhaps have a long-term relationship. She was fulfilling herself professionally, but something was missing in her life. After separating from her husband, there was no man by her side, and she already felt the need to meet someone new. She was still a young woman and did not want to spend the rest of her life alone. Besides, she dreamed of becoming a mother. With her ex-husband, they had no children, and Toni hoped to still have a child. Realizing that she didn't have much time left, she couldn't put off this decision for too long. When she met Harold online, she immediately had the impression that this was the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. They understood each other very well. He too, like Toni, was a successful man, was a businessman, and also a wealthy fundraiser for hospitals and churches. This impressed Toni very much. She guessed that he must be a good person, since it is important to him how such facilities function. Initially, the couple contacted each other mainly through the website on which they met. They were separated by 2,000 kilometers, and, for the time being, they kept in touch this way. As time passed, they started calling each other more, and both felt they were becoming closer. Both Toni and Harold wanted the same thing. They wanted to start a family based on Christian values. They both wanted very much to have a child. After 3 months or so spent on many hours of conversation, Toni and Harold came to the conclusion that it was time to meet. And Harold came to Jackson, where he had the opportunity to get to know not only Toni, but also her family. At the time, he made a great impression on both Toni and her relatives. Everyone thought he would be the perfect partner for her. Apparently, Toni and Harold also thought they were made for each other, because just 9 months after they met, they married on September 30th, 2000. Their families believed that this decision was made very quickly, but everyone could see that they were no longer the youngest. They were both under 40, and if they were serious about having children, they couldn't wait too long. After the wedding, Harold began to convince Toni to move. He thought it would definitely be better for them to live in Denver. First of all, he thought it was a better place to live. And secondly, he knew a lot of people there with whom he had business contacts. If he had to move to Jackson, he would have to make new contacts in that city. The decision to move was certainly not the easiest one for Toni. Her entire family lived in Jackson. Her parents, her brothers with their families, but also her friends. She had lived there since she was born, for almost 40 years. And it was not easy for her to leave all this and live in a completely different state. But what doesn't one do for love? Toni loved Harold very much and cared about this relationship. Maybe it would actually be better for the relationship when they started everything in a completely different place. Toni began to prepare for the move. She had a lot on her mind at the time, because in addition to transporting all of her personal, she also had to deal with the sale of her house, as well as the relocation of the clinic where she worked and which she co-owned. At the time, both she and Harold were very happy. They attended church together, where Toni played the piano and sang in the choir. In their free time, they enjoyed traveling, and if they didn't have that much time, they at least went for longer walks or played golf. Everyone saw them as a happily married couple. But over time, Toni's family noticed that she had begun to change. Before she met her husband, She was a confident woman who had no problems making decisions. But the longer the marriage lasted, the easier it became to see differences in her behavior. Everyone had the impression that she was subservient to Harold. He was the one who had the final say in their relationship. Everything that happened in their marriage depended on his decisions. Harold did not countenance her opinion, and shortly after they moved to Denver, he became the director of her clinic, despite the fact that he had never worked in such a position before, nor even had the knowledge of running an eye clinic. Apparently, Toni agreed to his every proposal, even if it seemed to make no sense. She was no longer the same strong woman. Everyone saw how much she had changed, everyone except Toni herself. It was Harold who decided about the finances in their relationship, despite the fact that Toni was the money earner in the marriage. Over time, however, it turned out that Harold was not the businessman he claimed to be. He did not earn much and was dependent on his wife. Nevertheless, he decided what the money was spent on. Harold was also very controlling of his wife. From the moment they were married, she was not allowed to speak freely on the phone with any member of her family. It was Harold who always answered the phone, and when he handed it to his wife, he always switched the calls to the speaker so he could hear what the conversation was about. But she didn't seem to mind all this. Her parents urged her to at least start controlling her finances more. Maybe it would have been better if her husband hadn't had access to her account and been able to dispose of her money. But despite the fact that this topic was brought up several times, nothing changed in this regard. It was her husband who decided on everything in their marriage, but she seemed to be happy. All the time she and Harold dreamed of having a child. Neither of them had children from previous relationships, and they were very anxious to expand their family as soon as possible. And they succeeded after 5 years of marriage. In 2005, the couple welcomed their daughter, Haley, into the world. She became the apple of her parents' eye, especially Harold, who, just as he had previously tried to take control of Toni's life, did the same after Haley was born. He was mainly in charge of raising the child, changing her diapers, or deciding what clothes she would wear. Toni didn't really have the opportunity to test herself as a mother, but despite all this, she remained in the marriage. Sometimes things got better between her and Harold, sometimes a little worse, but she didn't even think about ending the relationship. Maybe it was because her first marriage ended in divorce, and she really wanted to avoid another relationship failure. Or maybe it was the fact that their daughter had come into the world, and she wanted her to grow up in a complete family. However, Toni's family viewed her husband completely differently. They thought he was taking advantage of her, especially when it came to money. He himself earned very little in total. None of them even knew what he did for a living. Everyone had heard that he was a businessman, but no one knew any details about his work. They didn't know where he worked or if he worked at all. Toni's brothers even wanted to hire a private investigator to see what their brother-in-law's work consisted of, but their father didn't agree. And Toni, who came from a wealthy family, received money from her parents all the time. Her father owned a thriving business and shared revenue from it with his children. But despite this, money often began to run out of Toni's account. Harold was the one who had them, and it was difficult to determine what really happened to them. Apparently, he tried to invest them somewhere. However, what exactly happened to the money, Toni did not know. Her brothers and parents stopped trusting Harold, especially after what happened in late 2011. Harold and Toni went to a cottage in the mountains that they had bought some time earlier. When they got there, it turned out that something needed to be repaired on the spot, and Harold immediately set to work. However, after a while he asked his wife to help him. Toni was staying in the cottage at the time, but went outside. She went out of her room to the terrace, and at that moment she noticed that something was lying there. She bent down to pick it up, and that's when a huge beam fell on her, hitting her in the back of the neck, resulting in a fractured cervical spine. Toni was then taken to a hospital in Denver, where it turned out that the fracture was not that serious. At first it was unclear whether Toni would be able to return to her job, but as time passed doctors were more and more convinced that there would be no contraindications. Toni was very lucky, she realized, that if she had not bent down to pick up that object lying on the terrace when leaving the cottage, then it could have ended much worse. That day she might even have died. Fortunately, she managed to avoid death, but since then, Toni's family has begun to keep a close eye on her husband. They weren't convinced if it was indeed just an accident. They had a feeling that all of it could have been planned by Harold, so they asked Toni not to put herself in such situations alone with him anymore. However, she believed that these accusations were exaggerated. She didn't believe that Harold could want to kill her. What would be his purpose in doing so? Maybe their marriage wasn't perfect, but surely he had no reason to take her life. At the end of September 2012, their 12th wedding anniversary was approaching, so Harold decided to prepare a surprise for his wife. He wanted to take her to a hotel in the mountains for the weekend, so they could spend time together. There were many hiking trails near that hotel, and they could go for walks. Harold hoped it would be a nice weekend spent together. Tony was very surprised by the surprise he had prepared for her. Once they arrived, they both were very pleased with their stay. Tony sent her loved ones photos she managed to take there. Harold's idea seemed to be a hit, and the couple celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary in a nice way. But on the same day they left, Tony's brother, having dinner with his family, heard the landline phone ring. When he picked up the phone, he heard Harold's voice. He didn't say exactly what was going on, just told him to check the messages he had previously sent to his mobile phone. Before Tony's brother could ask what was going on, his brother-in-law disconnected the call. It was all very strange, and her brother didn't really know what was going on, why Harold couldn't just say why he was calling. He went to check the phone, which was in another room, and it turned out that Harold had indeed sent him several messages earlier. Urgent, Tony is injured. She fell from a cliff. Call for help. Tony's brother was also a doctor, and perhaps Harold thought it would be easier for him to summon a helicopter to their location. He realized there was no chance of any car getting there. A helicopter was the only solution. That was the only way to get help for Tony. At that time, her brother didn't know exactly what had happened there, but eventually he managed to contact Harold. He learned then that Tony had fallen from a cliff, fortunately from a low height, which allowed her to survive the fall. Harold tried to reach the place where she lay to help her, but it wasn't easy, and it took him about 15 minutes. Later, he called the emergency number. The voice on the phone to the 911 operator sounded urgent, slightly breathless. Hello, my name is Harold Henthorn. I'm in the Rocky Mountain National Park, and I need an Alpine Mountain Rescue team immediately. The operator transferred him to the National Park Service. My wife has fallen from a rock on the north summit of Deer Mountain, he said. She's in a really critical condition. She's had a bad fall, about 30 to 40 feet. The second operator told him to hold. For several seconds, you could just hear the man on the end of the phone breathing. Deer Mountain is one of the most popular spots for hikers in the Colorado Park. The route begins at Deer Ridge Junction, about 9,000 feet up in a grove of ponderosa pine trees, before ascending via zigzagging paths to the peak at 10,000 feet. While waiting for medical rescuers to arrive, he reportedly performed resuscitation according to the instructions given to him by the operator. But despite his efforts to do everything she told him, he couldn't save his wife. Tony ultimately did not survive the fall. It was a huge blow to both her family and Harold himself. He was in such shock that he couldn't even drive home by himself. After his wife's body was taken away by helicopter, he left with his friend who came specially for him. Harold didn't feel capable of driving alone, and the park employees took care of his car, which was on the premises of the national park. When they drove his car to the parking lot, they noticed something that definitely caught their attention. In the car, they found a map of the park with various trails marked on it. But what was strange to them was that someone had previously marked on this map the places where Tony's fall occurred. Could it have been a mere coincidence? Or perhaps it wasn't a random fall after all. When Harold was asked about this map, he couldn't explain why that place was marked, which raised even more suspicions. He couldn't say much about what happened there at all. He presented his version of events, but it kept changing all the time. Initially, he stated that when they were hiking with Tony on the trail they chose, there were too many people, so they decided to descend from it and take a different path. And when they were there, Harold received a text message which he began to read, and when he raised his head from his phone, Tony was gone. But there were also other versions of the events of that day. According to one of them, at some point, he lost sight of Tony, tried to find her, until he finally noticed that she had fallen from a cliff. But the family of the 50-year-old also heard a story about how Tony tried to take a picture of the birds and the fall occurred at that moment. Or the story about how she wanted to take a picture of her husband, and while doing so, she started backing up to get a better shot of Harold. Unfortunately, she backed up towards the cliff, and at one point she fell from there. Everyone was concerned about what they heard from Harold. How was it possible that in just 2 days they heard so many different versions of what happened that day? Was any of these versions true? Tony's father doubted it. He suspected that everything Harold told them was a lie. Something made him believe that his daughter was pushed off the cliff that day. Harold's later behavior only reinforced everyone's suspicions. It was very important to him that his wife's body be cremated as soon as possible. Tony's family did not want to allow cremation. They believed Tony wanted a traditional burial. However, Harold provided them with a letter signed by his wife stating that after her death, her body was to be cremated. And since that was her will, no one in the family opposed it. And just a few days after Tony's death, her body was cremated and the ashes scattered in the mountains. Family couldn't stop thinking about what happened to her. The more they thought about the fall, the more doubts they had. They didn't believe it was an accident. Nothing seemed to fit. The autopsy revealed that she hit a tree while falling, which resulted in a significant head wound. Tony's brother, who was a doctor, knew that such a wound must have bled a lot, and Tony must have lost a lot of blood. However, he distinctly remembered that Harold didn't even mention it when he called him right after the fall. This matter was suspicious enough for the police to start investigations. There were strong indications that Harold might have assisted Tony in her fall. Also against him was the call he made right after Tony's fall. He called the emergency number, where he was instructed on how to perform CPR. But the operator who spoke to him that day was convinced that the man did not follow any of her instructions. She had dealt with people performing CPR before and knew how someone who was doing it sounded like while trying to answer questions. The person performing CPR usually gets out of breath. However, nothing like that could be heard from Harold. He talked to the operator freely, and the woman was convinced he did nothing during the call. Moreover, when the paramedics arrived at Tony's location, she didn't look like someone who had received first aid. The lipstick on her lips was in perfect condition. It wasn't smeared at all. Everything pointed more and more towards Harold as the person responsible for his wife's death. Investigators decided to retrace the route the couple had taken that day. Both of them took a lot of pictures during the hike, and thanks to them and the information provided by Harold, the police could accurately reconstruct the route they had taken. They saw that the couple went hiking early in the afternoon, and initially planned to take the easier trail. Tony had knee problems, had already undergone 3 surgeries, and shouldn't have been walking on steep terrain. However, there were so many people on that trail that around 3:30 p.m., they decided to descend from it and take their own path. They found a place with a beautiful view where they stopped for a moment to eat something. During this break, they noticed a place below with a beautiful view. They decided to go down there and arrived at 4:45 p.m. It was from this place that Tony fell half an hour later. However, Harold didn't immediately call for help. There was poor reception in that place, and he couldn't immediately call the emergency number. So first, he decided to go down to his wife and check what happened. It took him about 15 minutes, and the next 30 minutes were spent checking if she was still alive, as well as finding a place where the signal was strong enough for him to call from. He returned to Tony and allegedly performed CPR while waiting for rescuers to arrive. But because it wasn't easy to get there, they arrived around 8 p.m. In the meantime, Harold called the emergency number several times to inquire about the progress until he finally had to turn off his phone because the battery was almost completely drained. At least that's what he told the emergency number operator. But later, the investigators found out that after he allegedly turned off his phone, the man made 22 more calls and received 98 messages. Was Harold lying again? When the police went through the entire route previously taken by Tony and Harold and found themselves in the place from which, according to the man's testimony, his wife fell, they unanimously concluded that such a possibility did not exist. The terrain was shaped in such a way that she couldn't simply slip or fall by accident. The only way this could have happened was if she was pushed by someone else. It wasn't an accident at all. Harold got rid of his wife this way. But why would he do that? After all, she was the one supporting him financially. He didn't work much and could rely on the money Tony earned. If he killed her, he'd lose his means of support. However, not entirely, as investigators found that Harold could benefit financially from his wife's death. Without her knowledge, he took out several life insurance policies on her. Of course, if anything happened to her, he would collect the insurance money. If we were to add up the compensations he would receive in the event of his wife's death, Harold would enrich himself by a whopping $4.5 million. Was this his plan? Did he insure his wife for a substantial sum only to orchestrate her death? Everything pointed to that, but in reality, aside from circumstantial evidence, investigators had no proof. However, when this came to light, everyone began to wonder about what happened decades earlier. Precisely in May 1995. That's when the unfortunate accident happened, resulting in Harold's first wife's death. Could that also have been a coincidence, as everyone believed all these years? Could Harold have killed both his wives? Even a crematorium employee noted the similarities between the two cases. He remembered well that when Lynn, Harold's first wife, died, her husband insisted on her being cremated as quickly as possible. It doesn't happen too often for a family member of the deceased to push for such haste, but Harold behaved exactly that way in both cases. In both instances, he also possessed documents signed by his wives, in which they consented to cremation. Could this really have been a coincidence? But what happened in 1995? And how did Lynn die? One day, her husband invited her to dinner at a restaurant. It was supposed to be a romantic evening for two. While driving, they found themselves in a somewhat isolated place. Harold realized there wasn't much air in the front tire. He pulled over and began changing the tire with Lynn. Using the jack, he lifted the car and removed the tire. But then Lynn dropped one of the bolts she was holding, and it rolled under the car. As Lynn was significantly smaller than Harold, she slipped under the raised car to reach for the bolt. And while she was still under the car, an unfortunate accident occurred. Harold grabbed the removed tire and threw it into the trunk, causing the car to slide off the jack, and the woman was crushed by it. He himself couldn't pull her out from there, but shortly after a couple arrived and Harold stopped them, asking for help. They didn't have a mobile phone, so they drove to the nearest house to call for help from there. However, they couldn't find any phone, so they returned to the scene and helped Harold lift the car a bit to get Lynn out. The couple began performing CPR, although her husband didn't quite like it. He believed that no one should touch Lynn, as it wasn't known what injuries she had sustained. However, the couple paid no attention to Harold's words and continued to administer first aid until Lynn began breathing again. When the ambulance arrived, summoned by other passers-by, they took Lynn to the hospital. However, her injuries were so severe that they couldn't save her. She died on the operating table. In 1995, no one questioned Harold's words. It was believed that what he said was the truth, and that what he told the police actually happened. Lynn's relatives considered them a wonderful couple, and Harold an exceptional person. It never crossed their minds that he could have had anything to do with his wife's death. It must have been an accident. The police looked into the matter for 6 days. They had some doubts, but ultimately concluded that Lynn's death was an unfortunate accident. However, 17 years later, the police had many doubts about it and began to re-examine Lynn's death. It turned out that many issues were overlooked in the investigation into Harold's first wife's death. There were many questions that no one tried to find answers to back then. Harold used a jack that wasn't intended for his car. It was much weaker, and there was a risk that it wouldn't support the car. Allegedly this happened because the original jack had previously broken. However, no one even checked whether this was indeed the case or if Harold was telling the truth. On the wheel hub of the changed tire, you could visibly see a shoe print, which could suggest that someone tried to tighten the car. It could have been Harold's shoe print. Even a photo of the shoes he wore that evening was taken to compare the traces of his footwear with the imprint on the wheel hub. However, nothing more was done on this matter. People who knew Lynn also believed that she would never crawl under a car lifted on a jack. She was very sensible and would never do anything so dangerous, certainly not her. It also seemed suspicious that in the wheel Harold was changing, there was not completely missing air. The tire wasn't fully inflated, but it was in a similar condition to the other tires. Without major issues, the couple could reach the restaurant and later return home, especially since Harold, as he mentioned to the police, didn't really know how to change a car tire. This information also makes his decision seem strange. Not to accept the help of the mechanic who arrived that way, who saw them on an unlit road trying to change the tire, illuminating everything with a small flashlight. The man wanted to help him. He could park his car in such a way as to illuminate the place, and would gladly help in changing the tire itself. However, for some reason, Harold decided to reject this help. There were again many clues indicating that Harold contributed to the death of his first wife, especially since she, like Tony, also had a life insurance policy for a fairly high amount, $645,000. Apparently, this was Harold's way of getting rid of his wives while enriching himself in the process. When investigators began checking all the policies Harold had taken out, it turned out that Lynn and Tony were not the only women he had insured without their knowledge. The police discovered that Harold also took out a life insurance policy on his sister-in-law, Grace Ritchell, who was married to his first wife's brother. Was she supposed to be his third victim? It could be assumed that this was Harold's plan. This could have been his way of making money, because it turned out during the investigation into Tony's death that despite presenting himself as a successful businessman, Harold had not actually been working for 20 years. He also didn't help raise money for schools or hospitals. He simply did nothing, which is why he took control of the finances regarding Tony, so that his wife wouldn't find out about anything. Investigators had many clues allowing them to believe that Harold contributed to Tony's death. And in November 2014, he was arrested and charged with killing his wife. He was not charged with Lynn's murder, but everything related to her death was presented in court to show similarities between these cases. This was supposed to be evidence that Harold, in both cases, driven by the desire to get money from compensation, caused the deaths of his wives. He himself claimed that he did not plan to kill any of his wives. He always insisted that they were accidents. There was no evidence that he was lying, but there were so many clues that no one believed anymore that Tony fell off the cliff by herself. During the trial, which began at the end of 2015, the jurors could hear about all the lies Harold told the police. In addition to those mentioned earlier, Harold also assured the investigators that he had been to the place where Tony fell only once before. However, after checking his phone, it was established that he had been to those mountains 9 times before. And this was during the 6 weeks preceding his wife's death. One can only guess that he was devising a plan then and looking for a place that would be perfect for it. The issue of the ring Tony had on her finger that fateful day was also interesting. When rescuers arrived at the scene, the diamond that should have been there was missing. There was no indication that Tony hit the rocks with her hands. There were no wounds on them. How could a $30,000 diamond just fall out? The place where Tony fell was thoroughly searched, but the stone could not be found. But when after 8 months investigators returned to the scene, the twisted diamond was quickly found. Moreover, it was in plain sight, and it was difficult to understand how it could have been overlooked before. Unless it wasn't there at all then. After Tony's fall, Harold took the valuable diamond, but when he learned that the police were looking for it and were going to return to the scene, he then threw it there. Investigators considered this version to be quite probable. When the jurors went to deliberate, it took them about 10 hours to find Harold guilty of Tony's death. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. I know you often wonder what happens to a child after one parent dies and the other is sentenced to prison. Tony and Harold had one child, a daughter named Haley, whose upbringing was taken over by Tony's brother and his wife. They were very keen to adopt her and be able to raise her in a loving family. Story 2. In the narrow valleys of Andorra, where the snow-capped Pyrenees cradle the microstate like protective giants, the year 2000 arrived not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a cold silence that felt older than the mountains themselves. Tourists continued to flow in, skiers and wealthy tax exiles sipping wine in La Massana and browsing duty-free boutiques in Andorra la Vella. But beneath the surface of serenity, something darker brewed. It began with whispers, first among the staff of the Bank of the Pyrenees, then in the halls of the Department of Finance. Small discrepancies, unexplainable shortages, files misfiled and erased. Nobody panicked. Not at first. In a nation built on discretion and banking secrecy, irregularities were more often swept under expensive carpets than pulled into daylight. That was until a junior auditor named Teresa Soler disappeared on January 14th. She had taken a folder home over the weekend, intent on reconciling ledgers that her supervisor told her to ignore. She never returned. Her apartment was undisturbed. Her car sat untouched beneath a powder of snow in the lot. But the folder, along with every digital copy of the data she'd been examining, was gone. The police offered no explanation. Some suggested she'd fled. Others whispered of suicide. But to Inspector Joel Andrew, something about it stank of precision, like a knife wound made to look like an accident. Andrew had been with the Andorran police for 15 years. He'd seen his share of smuggling operations, falsified residency applications, and the occasional corruption case. But this was quiet, calculated, and far too clean. Teresa had no reason to vanish. No debt, no boyfriend, no enemies that anyone could name. But she did have one thing, curiosity. She had been poking around in one of the few systems not connected to any outside regulatory body, the National Registry of Anonymous Accounts. It was a relic from the old banking model, maintained under digital lock and key. Anonymous deposits were a dying feature in global finance, but Andorra, stubborn and secretive, had resisted reform longer than most. And now, it seemed, someone was willing to kill to protect it. When Andrew gained access to her audit trail through the bank's internal terminals, he noticed she'd flagged 6 accounts for unusual activity. The accounts all showed sudden withdrawals totaling nearly 70 million euros in converted currency, spread across 2 weeks in December. And all of them were linked, albeit through heavily obscured metadata, to a shell company registered under the name Alpinia Holdings, a company that, officially, didn't exist. His inquiries led him to a quiet office block on the outskirts of Gordny, nestled between a ski rental shop and a florist that hadn't opened in years. Alpinia Holdings was listed on the building directory, but the office was locked, the blinds drawn. When Andrew returned with a warrant, the room had been wiped. Computers missing, files shredded, walls bare. The only thing left was a single business card taped to the inside of a drawer. It read simply, "We trust the snow to bury what we leave behind." It was less a clue than a warning. Andrew knew what it meant. Someone believed in invisibility. Someone who knew the terrain, who counted on Andorra's isolation and political ambiguity to shield them. But what they hadn't counted on was Andrew's tenacity. A week later, he traced one of the withdrawn funds to an external bank in Geneva, transferred under diplomatic privilege using forged documents from the Andorran Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's when he realized this wasn't just a banking scandal, it was state-level treason. He took the information to his superior, Commissioner Ramon Salvat, expecting resistance. Instead, he got silence. Salvat skimmed the report, closed the folder, and said only, "You've done enough." That night, Andrew's home was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but his notes were photographed, his laptop tampered with. Someone was watching him. Someone inside the force. So he did the only thing left to do. He went to the press. Or rather, to a journalist named Clara Vidal, who had once been Andrew's source on a weapons trafficking case involving Catalan separatists. She didn't flinch. Clara took the risk, published an exposé under the title "Ghost Accounts in the Snow," and within hours, the government went into lockdown. But it wasn't the scandal that exploded first, it was Clara's car. It was found in flames on the side of a mountain road the next day, her body charred beyond recognition. The official report blamed an engine fire. Andrew knew better. He'd seen the same MO in a NATO file on contract assassins used by intelligence services. Now it was war. Andrew became a ghost himself, ditching his badge, working through burner phones and cheap motels, digging through every scrap of evidence he could gather. He discovered that Alpinia Holdings had ties not only to the banking elite of Andorra, but also to foreign investors from Luxembourg, Panama, and Saudi Arabia. The accounts were part of a laundering operation funneling money through shell companies into arms deals and political campaigns across Europe. The corruption ran so deep that even elected ministers had offshore ties to the funds. And the worst part, someone inside the Constitutional Court had signed off on immunity clauses protecting emergency national transactions. It meant the theft was legal, if framed properly. Teresa Soler had uncovered not just missing numbers, but the architecture of modern fraud. And they had killed her to keep it from unraveling. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher across the rooftops of Andorra la Vella, Andrew made one final move. He broke into the ministry's archives during a blackout caused by a freak blizzard, stealing classified files that showed direct communication between the finance minister and a private bank in Zurich. He sent the files to a trusted contact at Interpol along with a statement, "If I disappear next, you'll know why, and you'll know who to look for." He signed it with Teresa's name. Inspector Joel Andrew had always believed in justice, but as he watched Interpol's silence stretch into days, then weeks, he realized justice wasn't blind, it was willfully deaf. The files he'd risked his life to send had triggered nothing but polite acknowledgments and bureaucratic delays. No agents arrived. No arrests were made. Instead, he noticed unfamiliar cars parked near whichever hostel he used. He heard clicks on the line during his rare phone calls. Even the baker near the southern border began offering him glances that were a shade too long to be harmless. Whatever faith he had in the system was now buried deeper than any of the bodies the conspirators had left behind. And still, despite the danger, he kept digging. One night, inside an abandoned Alpine chapel half buried in snow near Canillo, he met with a former banking official named Hervé Duran, who claimed to have helped create the very shell networks now tied to Alpinia Holdings. Hervé looked like a man broken by ghosts, his eyes ringed by sleeplessness, his voice a perpetual whisper. He spoke of pressure from the highest levels, of diplomatic bags stuffed with bearer bonds, of digital vaults accessible only with biometric keys held by people too powerful to refuse. The kicker was this: Andorra had become a node, not just a haven, for multinational laundering between embassies, private military contractors, and even pharmaceutical giants skimming funds from humanitarian aid. Duran handed over a key. Not metaphorically, but a real, old-fashioned steel key on a ribbon. It unlocked a safety deposit box in a nondescript building in Escaldes, beneath a health spa frequented by diplomats and retired generals. Inside, he muttered, are the names. Andrew knew what that meant. Not just transfers or shell companies, but the identities of people behind them, people who thought the fog of banking secrecy was eternal. When he opened the box 3 nights later, after dodging 2 tails and sleeping in a cave used by smugglers, he found a leather folder containing 12 pages. Each one bore a code name, a corresponding bank number, and, stamped across the margins, handwritten annotations clearly made by Teresa Solar. She had decoded the routing schemes, drawn connections, written conclusions. Operation White Track, Directive 209 Zurich Lux, and SRAX. She had figured it out before they killed her. At the bottom of the last page, there was one final name: Salvit. The commissioner himself. It wasn't just that he'd ignored the evidence, he was in it neck deep. Andrew's mind reeled. He now had enough to destroy lives, shatter careers, and trigger the political collapse of an entire microstate. But he was alone. The press was gagged. Foreign agencies had either been bought off or neutralized. Even Interpol, once his last hope, had gone silent. He had one card left to play: smuggle the documents out of the country to someone who couldn't be silenced. And that someone, he decided, was Sofia Mendez, a Spanish journalist exiled from Madrid after exposing a royal scandal and now living in Toulouse. She owed him nothing, which was why he trusted her. He contacted her using an encrypted radio frequency used by mountaineering guides, then crossed the border on foot, using trails only known to smugglers and shepherds. Each footstep in the snow was a risk. Drones buzzed overhead. He couldn't trust the border guards. Twice he lay frozen against rock faces while convoys passed beneath. But finally, on a misty February dawn, he reached a safe house in Aix-les-Thermes, France, where Sophia waited, tape recorder in hand. She listened without blinking, her cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers. When he handed her the folder, her hands trembled, just slightly. "You realize this will burn half of Europe's trust in Andorra," she said. "Let it burn," he replied. And burn it did. Mendez's article, published under the title White Track, Blood, Snow, and Gold in Andorra, hit the international stage like a shockwave. Names were named, accounts traced, countries forced to respond. The European Parliament issued an inquiry. Switzerland froze funds. Even the Vatican issued a statement condemning financial sins that endanger lives. But in Andorra, the truth had a different cost. Within 48 hours, Commissioner Salvit resigned, citing health reasons. A week later, he was found dead at his chalet in El Surat, an apparent suicide, though the absence of fingerprints and the presence of foreign gunpowder residue on the revolver said otherwise. Still, there was no real justice. Most of the stolen money was never recovered. The people behind the shell companies retreated deeper into their labyrinths. Ministers stepped down but were quietly rehired months later as consultants. Andrew, meanwhile, was declared rogue, a traitor, his badge stripped, his assets frozen. He now lived under an alias in Galicia, fishing by day, sending encrypted files to watchdog groups by night. Teresa Solar never received the memorial she deserved. Her family was told she drowned while hiking alone. And Clara Vidal, the journalist who'd paid with her life, became nothing more than a photo on an unvisited tribute wall. But sometimes, when the wind howled down through the stone alleys of Andorra la Vella, and tourists wandered the Christmas markets with mulled wine and blind wallets, an older man could be seen standing at a distance, watching the bank where it all began. He never approached, never spoke, but his eyes held the weight of every buried truth. And in the hush between falling snowflakes, if you listened closely, you might hear the faintest echo of a name: Teresa, carried on the wind like a secret waiting to thaw. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. The winter fog hung low over Baku like a funeral shroud, muffling the cries of the gulls and masking the scent of crude oil that never truly left the Caspian air. In the year 2000, the city was caught between its Soviet past and a capitalist future still teetering on the edge of corruption, where pipelines carried promises across continents, and behind every glossy development billboard was the shadow of an old crime. It was in this murky transitional period that Inspector Cameron Suleimanov found himself standing over the bloodied body of a mid-level Ministry of Energy accountant in a half-collapsed Soviet-era apartment block in Yasemel, his throat slashed, a warning carved in Cyrillic across his chest. Hands off the oil. The man's name was Javid Karimov, and on the surface he was nobody, a quiet, aging bureaucrat with a sick mother and a reputation for punctuality, the kind of man people barely noticed. But Inspector Suleimanov, whose instincts were honed not by academy training, but by a decade of watching bribes pass like handshakes, knew this wasn't random. It had the smell of something deeper, too precise to be a message for just one man, and too amateurish to be a professional hit. It was a warning disguised as chaos, and it reeked of internal betrayal. In a nation whose wealth now flowed in barrels beneath the Caspian, oil was the new blood currency, and those who touched the veins of the industry often did not live long enough to wash their hands. Karimov had been auditing contracts tied to an obscure offshore firm based in the Isle of Man, CASP Energo Limited, a name that appeared nowhere in public records but showed up repeatedly in internal ministry files next to inflated pipeline maintenance costs. When Cameron requested the files, he was stonewalled, not by the ministry, but by the President's Economic Development Committee, whose authority had, on paper, nothing to do with petroleum audits. That's when he knew it was serious. Karimov had uncovered something too big to suppress quietly, and someone up the chain had panicked. But what made Cameron's skin crawl wasn't the crime itself. It was the name whispered to him by a low-level typist in the ministry cafeteria 2 days later, eyes darting around like a mouse caught in an alley full of cats, Razum Dadasov. The same Razum who, in 1994, had disappeared for a year after allegations of fund embezzlement during the first BP-Azerbaijan joint venture. The same Razum now acting as special advisor to the state oil company of Azerbaijan Republic, SOCAR. Cameron had no warrant, no backup, and no hope of help from above, but he had spent years quietly collecting favors. Men he'd pulled from prison cells in exchange for information, women he'd spared from prosecution for petty forgeries. He called on one, Lala Imanova, a cyber technician turned hacker for hire who now lived in the shadows of Sabale. For a price, she broke into Razum's private communications network, allegedly encrypted, and downloaded emails tying him to CSB Energo's monthly consultancy payments of $200,000, routed through a Moscow bank and ending in a numbered account in Cyprus. In one chilling memo marked confidential, urgent, Razum authorized an accelerated cleanup in Baku, referencing a leak risk and suggesting subcontractor methods used in Turkmenistan. Cameron had seen subcontractor methods before. They didn't leave survivors. Worse still, the email was CC'd to an address simply labeled YM. That was enough to make him sit down in the dark with a trembling cigarette. Yusuf Mammadov, Minister of Internal Affairs. He now understood why Karimov had died, not just because he knew something, but because he had refused a bribe. He had tried to alert the press. His calls to 3 journalists had been traced, and all 3 reporters were now either missing, jailed on tax charges, or conveniently on extended vacations abroad. One had even relocated to Belarus, a place no Azerbaijani journalist willingly chose without coercion. Cameron stared out at the port from his cramped office window, wondering how many more people would die before someone dared to act. He no longer saw his badge as a shield, but as a target, yet something in him refused to let go. His father, a poet once imprisoned for sedition, had raised him on verses about fire and justice, about a land where truth was oil in its rawest form, dark, flammable, and suffocating. That night, Cameron left the precinct for the last time, taking with him a flash drive, a handgun, and a fading sense of purpose. He had one destination in mind, a crumbling villa in Shikhof, where Razum was rumored to host off-the-books meetings with foreign investors. Cameron didn't expect to find Razum. He expected to die trying. But there was always the off chance, one last roll of the dice, that if he could extract a confession, a file, a document, something damning enough to ignite scandal, maybe, just maybe, someone outside would pay attention. As he made his way through the maze of coastal roads, every headlight behind him felt like a threat. Every checkpoint a potential trap. He switched cars twice, took alleyways he hadn't driven since his days working vice. And at 2:47 a.m., he arrived at the villa, empty-looking but humming with electricity. He climbed the wall, slipped past the rear garden, and saw through the window 2 silhouettes inside, Razum, unmistakable in his square-shouldered frame, and a foreigner, tall, balding, his accent thick with London vowels. Cameron recorded every word he could through a directional mic, talk of backdated invoices, a new pipeline route through Georgia, payments scheduled via shell firms with names like Petri Unity and New Horizons LLC. It was enough to bury them all, if only he could make it out alive. Cameron's heart thudded in his ears as he pulled back from the villa window, the cold night air biting through his coat like jagged glass. He had the recording, clear enough to be admissible in court, if there had ever been such a thing as justice in a courtroom untouched by oil money. But as he turned to slip back through the garden, a flicker of light from the upstairs balcony froze him in place. A third man, sniper, guard, or another stakeholder. It didn't matter. Cameron dropped low, moving fast across the narrow hedge, breath shallow, ears tuned for footsteps. He made it to the wall, scaling it with hands scraped raw against broken cement, and was halfway down the other side when the gunshot shattered the silence. It missed, barely, but it was enough to split the illusion of secrecy. Alarms blared from within. Voices barked in Russian and Azeri. Cameron sprinted into the darkness, dodging down a forgotten ravine behind the villas, the USB drive clutched like a talisman. He didn't stop until he reached a safe house in Bedamder, owned by an old journalist friend who'd been silenced years ago with a state pension and the quiet threat of an accidental house fire. The next morning, with blood dried at his collar and sleep only a memory, Cameron called his contact in Tbilisi, a half-Georgian ex-diplomat who now trafficked in truths no one else dared carry. He arranged for a courier to smuggle the flash drive across the border, disguised in a box of old medical supplies, bound for a Western media liaison embedded in a British embassy. The package would take 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the border guard's moods. In that time, Cameron had to disappear, erase himself from every ledger, leave no trail that could lead Razum, or worse YM, to the files. But he knew the state's reach extended into every phone line, every airport kiosk, every border crossing. So instead, he played dead. He left his badge floating in the polluted waters of the Kura River, staged a burnt-out car wreck with blood from a pig butchered in Sadarak Market, and leaked a tip anonymously to a corrupt precinct captain, suggesting that Cameron had fled to Iran, joining a separatist group with political asylum. It worked. For 48 hours, the ministry scrambled its efforts across the south. The real Cameron hid inside the city itself, moving like a ghost through basements and mosques, always one cigarette ahead of betrayal. On the third day, news reached him that a BBC segment was about to air, sourced from leaked documents implicating Azerbaijani oil officials in financial misconduct. It was vague, sanitized, but it was enough to stir the hornet's nest. Razum vanished from public events. Sokar released a denial so polished it reeked of premeditation. And within hours, Cameron's safe house was burned to ash, his journalist friend missing. The response was surgical, calculated. YM had activated what Cameron had always feared existed, an internal network of loyalists operating above the law. Former KGB, now tied to private military firms and foreign security consultants. Cameron realized something else then. This wasn't just about national corruption. The British investor speaking to Razum wasn't acting alone. There were multinationals involved, companies with stock tickers and shiny websites that masked the rot beneath. He was no longer a detective chasing a killer. He was a witness in a geopolitical game where casualties weren't counted, just covered. On the fourth day, Cameron received a call from a burner number routed through Istanbul. A female voice, British, terse, offered him sanctuary. "You've shaken something too large to contain," she said. "If you want to live, you leave now." But Cameron hesitated. In exile, the truth would wither. The files had broken the silence, but the system had only flinched, it hadn't fallen. The real change required something public, something undeniable. So instead of leaving, Cameron decided to surface. Not as a fugitive, as a martyr. He contacted a popular news anchor who had long since stopped reporting real news, but still commanded the trust of the older generation. He offered an interview on record, face visible, names spoken aloud. He told the whole story: Karimov's death, the audit, Razum, the shell companies, the offshore transfers, and YM's role in ordering a cleanup. He included audio snippets, a partial email printout, just enough to make the rest of the flash drive seem real. The interview aired at midnight, preceded by warnings from state censors, but it spread faster than the government could stop it. Bootleg copies circulated on cassette tapes. Printouts of the leaked emails were taped to university doors by students emboldened by the chaos. Cameron knew what would happen next. There would be no arrest, no formal trial, Just erasure. The kind that came not with bullets, but with silence, an accident on the road to Cuba, a sudden heart attack in a public toilet, or maybe just an unexplained disappearance. But he had made peace with that. He'd already written letters to his sister in Ganja, to his mother buried near Sheki, to the girl he once loved before the city turned him to smoke. He waited in a hotel near the old Baku port, eyes on the sea, when they finally came. 3 men, coats too clean, eyes too still. They said nothing. Cameron stood, hands raised, not resisting. But before they could touch him, a scream erupted outside. Protesters. Hundreds. Then thousands. Someone had distributed leaflets linking Razum to the murders. Someone else had projected the interview onto the side of the National Assembly building. The people had seen too much. And for the first time, the regime blinked. Cameron was seized, yes, but the cameras caught it. And when his battered body was shown on TV 2 days later, handcuffed but defiant, a symbol had been born. He was no longer a detective. He was evidence. Living, breathing evidence that one man with a truth too loud to silence could crack the mask of power, just enough for others to see the rot underneath. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In the crisp winter of 2000, the air in Vienna carried with it more than the scent of roasted chestnuts and snow-dusted cobblestones. It was thick with unease, especially within the marbled walls of the Justizpalast, where a scandal, carefully buried for years, began to unravel like the final notes of a dying symphony. Inspector Lucas Thalberg, a veteran of the Bundeskriminalamt with a reputation for precision and a disdain for theatrics, stood before the shattered remains of the stained-glass door of the Hofburg's West Library, his eyes narrowed at the corpse sprawled in grotesque stillness against the worn parquet floor. The victim, Heinrich Wolf, a respected financial consultant with ties to several prominent Viennese banks and an unofficial advisor to the Ministry of Finance, had died not of old age, but of intent. His throat had been slashed with clinical precision, and scattered beside his limp fingers were fragments of a fountain pen bearing the insignia of the Österreichische National Bank. Thalberg knew from the moment he stepped into the room that this wasn't a robbery, nor a crime of passion. It was a message, and like all messages in Vienna's elite circles, it was delivered with the kind of artistry that concealed as much as it revealed. The real mystery wasn't who killed Wolf, but who had finally decided his silence was no longer useful. The investigation began with decorum, questions for the guards, reviews of the guest lists, polite visits to the banking offices Wolf had frequented. But Thalberg had been through too many of these curated inquiries to believe in surface-level interrogations. He dug deeper, pulling old files from the 1994 audit scandal that had briefly implicated Wolf in embezzlement involving offshore accounts in Liechtenstein. That case had been closed in under a week, sealed by a federal judge with unusually swift signatures and media silence that smelled of political deodorant. Thalberg reopened it unofficially, pouring through call records and anonymous transfers logged in bank archives that no longer existed publicly. A pattern emerged, names of shell corporations with poetic Latin titles, all created within 3 weeks of one another, and all eventually routing money to a firm listed at a post office box in Salzburg, an address linked discreetly to a former defense minister now serving as a diplomat in Brussels. The further Thalberg reached, the more delicate the connections became. Parliamentary figures, industrial magnates, even one retired opera star whose husband sat on the board of Austria's largest weapons contractor. The deeper he dug, the less it looked like a single murder, and more like the eruption of a long-dormant volcano whose lava had just found its first victim. 3 days after the murder, Thalberg received an unmarked envelope slid under the door of his office at dawn. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph of Wolf at a chalet in Tyrol, sitting beside a man believed to have died in a plane crash in 1998. Dr. Egon Markel, a former economist turned whistleblower, whose claims about insider trading within the National Bank had been discredited as delusional ramblings. The photo was dated November 1999. Thalberg immediately contacted the Tiroler Kriminaldienst, who confirmed that the chalet in the photo belonged to a Marcus Keller, a name with no criminal record, but a curious history of changing addresses every few months and running consultancies for private energy firms. When Keller was finally tracked down, he had vanished, leaving behind only a wall safe pried open and a burned ledger in the fireplace. But a single unscorched scrap remained, just enough to read a name: Project Faust. Thalberg, now working off-book with a trusted analyst named Greta Vogel, uncovered that Project Faust had once been a classified intelligence operation approved under the pretense of protecting Austrian economic sovereignty after the fall of the Iron Curtain. In reality, it was a slush fund designed to buy political influence across Eastern Europe and launder money through cultural grants and art acquisitions, most of which had passed through Wolf's hands. As Thalberg compiled his findings into a report meant for the federal prosecutor, he received an anonymous tip warning him that the ghosts of the Republic protect their own. Hours later, his car brakes failed on the drive back from Innsbruck. A clean cut through the hydraulic line confirmed sabotage. Rather than panic, he grew more convinced that he had come dangerously close to a truth not meant to surface. With Greta's help, he organized a clandestine interview with a retired archivist from the Austrian State Archive, who confirmed that many documents regarding Project Faust had been redacted not by the usual security agencies, but by a private legal firm with ties to the family of Austria's current chancellor. The implications were clear. Wolf had either threatened to go public or was blackmailing someone powerful, and he'd paid for it with his life. Inspector Lucas Thalberg's breath misted in the frozen air as he stood alone at the entrance of the Zentralfriedhof, Vienna's monumental cemetery, where Heinrich Wolf had just been buried in a ceremony more guarded than mourned. Suited men with eyes too alert for grief and expressions too blank for memory watched from black sedans parked at a respectful yet strategic distance. A light snow began to fall, cloaking the marble angels and moss-covered headstones in a hush that could almost pass for peace. But Thalberg felt none. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, not from cold, but from the weight of what he now knew. Project Faust was not just a relic of Cold War paranoia or clandestine economic experiments. It was alive, breathing beneath the polished facade of Austrian civility, operating like a ghost government beneath the elected one. And every stone he overturned led closer not to justice, but to a black maw where careers, reputations, and entire lives had disappeared. Yet he could not stop. Greta Vogel had deciphered more of the burned ledger from the Tyrolean chalet, using forensic software. Names, numbers, and a specific series of monthly transfers to a Swiss account linked to a firm called Vost Ventures, a firm partially owned by a sitting member of the National Council. Even worse, one of those transfer notations, dated the same week Wolf was murdered, read cryptically, "Final installment before silencing. Confirmed through Channel B." Thalberg and Vogel now understood Wolf had become a liability, perhaps after a sudden attack of conscience, or a failed attempt at leverage that backfired. They knew the clock was ticking. Days after they compiled their findings in a secure drive, Vogel's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but her laptop was left on, a single sticky note on the screen reading, "Curiosity kills the honest." She refused to leave Vienna, though Thalberg pleaded with her to take temporary refuge abroad. "If we run," she told him, "we become ghosts like the rest of them." That same night, Thalberg made contact with a former operative from the Abwehrmacht, the Austrian military intelligence agency, who had once worked as a handler for economic surveillance operations in the 1990s. The man, known only by the codename Hecht, agreed to meet in a disused U-Bahn station under the guise of a service inspection. In the flickering light of the platform, Hecht told Thalberg what he already feared. Project Faust had never been shut down. Its leadership merely rotated, like ministers, like board members, like seasons in Vienna. And Wolf, once a loyal accountant to the operation, had begun leaking subtle details in economic journals and white papers, cloaked in academic jargon but dangerous to anyone who read between the lines. Hecht believed the order to kill Wolf came not from desperation, but calculation, a warning to others still inside the web. Hecht also warned Thalberg that the BKA had been infiltrated at upper levels, particularly the Economic Crimes Division. "You're not chasing shadows anymore," he said grimly. "You're chasing your own government." That night, Thalberg returned to his flat only to find the place ransacked, not clumsily but surgically. His notes were untouched, but one thing was missing: a microcassette he had received anonymously 2 weeks earlier, believed to contain audio from a confidential board meeting at the National Bank. He had only partially transcribed it, but he remembered a specific line: "Wolf's hesitance is a threat to continuity. Secure resolution immediately." The theft confirmed what Hecht said. He was being watched not by outsiders, but by insiders. The web was closing in, so he made a decision. He contacted Vogel and arranged to leak their findings to a trusted journalist from Der Standard, using an old Cold War dead-drop method in the Prater amusement park. At the foot of the giant Ferris wheel, he left a locked case containing printouts, photographs, and the backup USB. But when the journalist, Emil Bauer, failed to check in 2 hours later, Thalberg knew something had gone wrong. The following morning, Bauer's car was found burning in the Wiener vault, no sign of his body, only his press credentials left in the glove box. It was an unmistakable message: silence is survival. Vogel, now visibly shaken, agreed to flee the city. Thalberg bought her a train ticket to Prague under a false name and watched her board, eyes scanning every face on the platform. He never saw her again, but weeks later, an encrypted email landed in his inbox, bearing only 3 words: "I made it." With Greta safe, he focused on his final move. He no longer believed justice could come from within Austria. Instead, he forwarded his remaining evidence, including Heck's testimony, the burned ledger, and transcripts of Wolf's encrypted financial records, to an investigative bureau in The Hague. Whether they would act, he didn't know. But it was the only place left not infected by the rot he had uncovered. 2 days after the transmission, he was summoned to a closed-door inquiry at the Ministry of Interior. The panel, dressed like undertakers, offered him a quiet reassignment to an overseas post. He declined. That evening, walking home through the museum quarter, Thalberg felt the barrel of a small-caliber pistol pressed gently into his spine. A voice, calm, cultured, whispered, "You've had your dance, Inspector. Now bow." But no shot came. Instead, a package arrived at his office the next morning. A ticket to Geneva, a one-way flight. The unspoken offer: exile in place of execution. He took it. Some truths, he now understood, did not live in daylight. And in Vienna, the past wasn't buried. It sat beneath glass and marble, watching and waiting. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. The rain fell in a persistent drizzle over Amsterdam, muting the city's colors into a tapestry of slate and shadow as Detective Willem van Dijk stood at the edge of the Herengracht Canal, watching divers pull a body from the water. It was the third in 2 weeks, each victim male in their mid-30s, and each missing for precisely 9 days before being found submerged, throats slit cleanly with a precision that spoke of ritual rather than rage. The press had started calling the unknown perpetrator de Slipper, the Slipper, though Van Dijk despised the sensationalism. He knew this was no ordinary killer, no random psychopath taking pleasure in chaos. There was a message in the method, one only partially decoded through the faded photographs found in the victims' wallets. Images from a secret party in a disused warehouse in Newark, stamped with the date April 15, 2000, and a symbol, a triangle inside a circle, etched like a brand in the corner. That symbol led him down Amsterdam's narrowest alleys and deepest bureaucratic archives, chasing whispers of an underground society that had allegedly been disbanded in the 1980s. The obscured circle, once rumored to host elite gatherings for politicians, artists, and financiers, where vice was dressed as freedom and silence bought with diamonds and secrets. Van Dijk was no stranger to Amsterdam's underbelly, but this was different. The circle had long been dismissed as myth by his colleagues, but the patterns were undeniable. The victims all once worked for a boutique investment firm, De Keyser and Van Raalte, known for managing portfolios of clients too powerful to name in public. The firm had been dissolved 2 years earlier under quiet but suspicious circumstances, and its founders had since scattered, some abroad, some into new aliases. But one name kept recurring in the files Van Dijk recovered from the city's dusty archives. Clara Veenstra, a once prominent socialite turned vanished enigma after a scandal involving an art forgery ring in 1992. Clara, it seemed, had resurfaced in the shadows, possibly as the orchestrator of something more sinister than forgeries, perhaps even the recruiter of the circle's modern iteration. The detective traced a property deed to a centuries-old canal house in De Wallen, long believed abandoned, yet still drawing electricity according to city records. When he entered the house with a warrant, accompanied by 2 plainclothes officers, they found nothing but dust, an overturned chair, and a single vinyl record playing on repeat, Eric Satie's Nasian No. 1. On the mantel was a burned-out candle and, scratched into the stone hearth, the same triangle circle symbol. There were no fingerprints, no living souls, but a crawlspace in the basement revealed a trove of 8mm film reels labeled only with numbers and months. Van Dijk had them developed and watched in horror as the flickering images revealed masked gatherings where blindfolded guests were led through increasingly degrading rituals, all under the watch of a veiled woman with a sharp jawline and an unmistakable scar above her eyebrow, Clara. The footage dated back as far as 1998. He realized then that the victims may not have been murdered randomly, but silenced as potential whistleblowers. Each of them likely present at these events. Each of them possibly willing to talk. But who else had been involved? That was the question that made Van Dyke hesitate every time he looked at his own superiors. In a city where wealth could purchase not only influence but invisibility, trust became as fragile as the porcelain tulip figurines that lined his grandmother's windowsill. When the fourth body surfaced near the Sloterdijk railway yard, a lawyer formerly employed by a municipal zoning committee, Van Dyke's stomach turned. The man had gone missing days after filing an internal complaint that certain canal properties were being used for unauthorized nighttime events, but the complaint had mysteriously vanished from the record system. Van Dyke began to suspect not just collusion, but institutional decay. How many hands had to be paid, how many eyes turned, to let this operation thrive undetected? He confronted his captain with the new evidence, only to find himself placed on administrative leave the next morning, his badge suspended for procedural misconduct after a leak to the press he hadn't authorized. The message was clear: stop digging. But Van Dyke didn't stop. He went rogue, using his old informants from the drug corridor between Bijlmer and Utrecht to track down a man known only as Dirk the Chemist, who once provided custom synthetics to high-end parties in the 90s. Dirk, now a ghost living above an illegal club, confessed under pressure that the circle had never truly dissolved. It had simply evolved, hiding behind a web of dummy corporations and old money foundations, many of which had ties to Van Dyke's own precinct and city council. As he left Dirk's hideout, a van tried to run him down in the narrow alleyway. He survived, barely, bruised and burning with clarity. This was no longer a homicide investigation. It was war against the rot underneath Amsterdam's polished brickwork. But Van Dyke wasn't alone. A young journalist named Elise van der Meer, recently fired from the Telegraph for pursuing stories deemed too conspiratorial, reached out with a cache of emails linking Clara Veenstra's last known address to a non-profit art foundation, funded through shell companies traced back to the same triangle circle logo. Together, they plotted a leak to Interpol, knowing that the Dutch authorities were too compromised to act from within. But the question remained: where was Clara now? And how far would the circle go to protect what it had built? By the time the autumn mist had settled again over the Amsterdam canals, Van Dyke and Elise were living like fugitives in their own city, moving from borrowed flats to rundown hostels, their communication reduced to burner phones and coded notes slipped beneath park benches. Every lead they chased brought them closer to a ghost. Clara Veenstra was everywhere and nowhere, like a phantom of Amsterdam's decadent past lingering in the present's peripheral vision. Elise had dug up records from a forgotten registry that listed a private exhibition Clara had curated back in March 2000 at a now-defunct gallery in Harlem. The exhibit, titled Anatomy of Memory, was comprised entirely of blurred portrait photographs, each stamped with the triangle circle emblem in red wax, and disappeared just weeks before the first victim went missing. Though the event had been erased from official listings, Elise found references to it on an old artist forum. One user posted that they had never felt more seen, and yet more violated, after attending. It was the kind of breadcrumb that confirmed their theory. This wasn't just about murder or blackmail. It was a performance, a control of narrative and perception, crimes staged like art, documented for a private audience whose tastes had long since turned grotesque. Meanwhile, Van Dyke's former colleagues had gone silent. Those he trusted were either transferred, suspended, or worse. One forensics analyst, a young man named Peter, who had discreetly helped analyze the 8mm reels, was found dead in his car in a garage in Zaandam, the engine running, the radio playing Satie once more. Carbon monoxide, the report said. Suicide. But Van Dyke knew better. He remembered Peter's last words to him. There's a pattern in the candle's smoke. It's not random. He didn't know what it meant at the time. But now, scouring through every frame of the 8mm footage again in Elise's flat, he noticed something chilling. In each scene, in each dim-lit ritual, the candle placed nearest the masked audience always flickered in sequence, as if responding to sound, Morse code. Layered beneath the footage, almost invisible unless one knew where to look, was a message broadcast in flame. Names, dates, initials. One of them was WVD, Willem van Dyke. Another was Evdem, Elise van der Meer. They were being watched long before they began investigating. The circle wasn't reacting. It was predicting. Elise's hands trembled as she played the frames back again and again, and it dawned on both of them that the final victim wasn't someone in the reels. It was one of them. Their leak to Interpol had gone unanswered, and a contact in Belgium confirmed that the files were intercepted mid-transit and flagged as fabricated. The rot, they now realized, stretched across borders, deeper than either of them could have imagined. They had no choice but to go public. Elise, risking everything, coordinated a broadcast through a rogue server, once used by environmental activists, and scheduled a data dump for midnight. Emails, video stills, addresses, everything they had. But as the upload reached 72%, a blackout swept through the district. The lights snapped off. The air stilled. From the canal outside, the low hum of a boat engine whispered like a threat. Van Dyke told Elise to run. She refused. But they both knew how this story usually ended. Instead, they barricaded the door and lit the one candle they had, not out of symbolism but necessity. When the knock came, it was gentle, almost polite. Van Dyke pulled his service pistol from his coat. Elise had her camera. The door creaked open under pressure, and standing there was not Clara Veenstra, but a young girl, no older than 16, dressed in a gray school uniform, hair wet from the rain, holding a folder of photographs. "She said you'd need these," the girl whispered. "She's already gone." The girl handed over the folder and ran, vanishing into the mist. Inside the folder were Polaroids, dates scrawled on the backs. Faces familiar from the reels, but younger. One was a judge, another a well-known news anchor, a third a senior officer from Rotterdam. But in the center, in the largest photograph, was Clara, standing beside a man Van Dyke recognized not from any file, but from his childhood. His father, a man he had believed died in a boating accident when he was 9. The photograph was dated 1978. The circle, it seemed, was older than they thought, older than Van Dyke himself. A lineage, not a society. A legacy passed down like a cursed heirloom. The implications twisted something deep inside him. Had his father been part of it? Had he faked his death? Or was this photograph doctored to confuse and control him, the same way the reels controlled those who watched? The broadcast never went through. But Elise made backups, dozens, scattered in encrypted clouds, on flash drives mailed to foreign journalists, in books hollowed out and left in libraries across Europe. Clara had vanished again, but her game had changed. She was no longer just cleaning up old sins. She was setting a stage for a new act. Van Dyke no longer sought justice. He sought survival. In a city that had turned its back on its own protectors, where truth was drowned beneath the weight of tradition and privilege, he realized that the only way to expose the circle was not to fight it head-on, but to fracture it from within. They would vanish like Clara did, change their names, embed themselves in systems where they could listen, disrupt, and one day maybe end it. If the circle was a legacy, then perhaps their resistance could be one too. But the price of seeing the world as it truly was, that could never be undone. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. Whispers Beneath the Cobblestones. In the chill of a gray January morning in 2000, the cobbled streets of Bruges glistened under a thin veil of frost, deceptively quiet and picturesque, as if the city had not just borne witness to something unspeakable. Beneath the delicate chime of the belfry's bells and the aroma of hot waffles curling from roadside stalls, the body of a well-known art historian, Professor Henri de Setelier, was discovered inside the crypt of the Church of Our Lady. His hands were folded across his chest, eyes wide open, and a single strip of antique canvas had been stuffed into his mouth, a fragment from a lost Van Eyck altarpiece, long rumored to have been stolen during the war. The scene was not random, nor was it impulsive. Whoever killed Henri had prepared it like a message, an installation, a chilling tribute to a forgotten history only a handful of Belgians still whispered about. Inspector Adrian van Rompuy, a man of quiet demeanor but sharp intuition, was first on the scene. He had seen plenty in his 20 years with the federal police, smugglers, forgers, even sectarian killings during the splinters of the 90s. But this was different. This was theatrical, ritualistic, and worse, it was personal. Adrian knew Henri. Not well, but enough to remember the late-night symposiums where Henri would drink too much claret and speak in riddles about the codes hidden in Flemish oil. His obsession with stolen art was notorious, but his theories, about Nazi-era banking vaults under Antwerp, of secret sales brokered in shadowy boardrooms in Geneva, had made him more of a curiosity than a threat. Until now. The fragment of canvas recovered from Henry's mouth was quickly authenticated by a retired curator in Ghent as belonging to the missing left wing of the Mystic Lamb, last seen before World War II. That piece had been a subject of both legend and investigation for decades, tied to everything from Freemasonic conspiracies to Vatican cover-ups. For it to resurface now, and in this fashion, was no accident. Adrian found no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and no witnesses. Only a sigil had been left on the crypt wall in red wax, a circle pierced by 3 arrows. The same symbol, he would learn days later, that appeared on a set of classified documents buried deep in a Cold War-era archive in Brussels. Documents tied to something known only as operatai nakglas. The deeper Adrian dug, the more the lines between history, myth, and conspiracy began to blur. Operatai nakglas, it turned out, was a clandestine network formed in post-war Belgium. A group of aristocrats, ex-military men, and art dealers united under the pretense of recovering looted European artworks. But according to old transcripts and redacted files, their mission warped into something else. They didn't just recover art, they hid it, traded it, and in some cases, commissioned fakes to replace originals still hanging in museums today. By 1972, the network had gone dark, most of its members presumed dead or gone underground. Adrian's request for access to the case files was met with veiled warnings and outright stonewalling. His superior at the federal police, Chief Inspector Laubach, told him plainly, "Drop it. The settler was a drunk, and you've got nothing solid. Let the church handle its ghosts." But Adrian couldn't shake the image of that canvas in Henry's mouth, or the way the eyes had seemed to follow him in the dark. Then came the second body, this time in Liège, another academic, a quiet archivist named Clara Janssens. She was found in her apartment, seated in front of a cracked mirror, a pearl earring placed delicately on her tongue. Her notes revealed she had been researching private collections dating back to 1943, and in her fireplace, Adrian found the charred remains of a registry, a list of artworks, coded by initials and numbers. Clara had circled one entry in red ink, VL61. Adrian recognized the initials. Van Eyck, Louvre copy, 1961. A reproduction that had hung in the Royal Museum of Fine Arts since the early 70s. Except Clara had clearly believed it was not a reproduction. She had written in the margins, chemical inconsistencies. Base layer is not synthetic. The real painting, she believed, had never been returned. Like Henri, Clara had been digging too deep into truths long buried beneath Belgium's gilded facades. As Adrian traveled between Bruges, Liège, and Brussels, connecting dates and names like a man possessed, he began to suspect that operatai nakglas hadn't disappeared at all. It had simply evolved, becoming more discreet, more institutional. Hidden in plain sight, galleries, auction houses, and even the monument's office had all become part of a laundering apparatus for priceless artifacts, funded by ultra-wealthy patrons whose interests lay not in art appreciation, but in legacy, secrecy, and power. Adrian knew he couldn't trust the usual channels. Files began disappearing from his desk. His phone line crackled with interference. Once, returning home late, he found the lock on his apartment door had been changed, but nothing was taken. It was a message, a warning, and yet he couldn't stop. Not when he uncovered one final name in Clara's scorched ledger. One he recognized not from politics or art, but from family. His uncle, Willem van Rompuy, long thought to be a simple antiques dealer in Ghent, had been a silent partner in nakglas. And according to dated correspondence, he had custody of VL61 in 1974. Adrian didn't know what he'd find when he confronted his uncle in the creaking manor on the outskirts of Ghent. But he brought a recorder, a pistol, and a printed copy of the registry. Willem, now in his 80s, didn't deny it. In fact, he smiled. "We thought we were saving Europe," he said, sipping tea in a room lined with oil paintings that may or may not have been authentic. But beauty, once hidden, becomes an obsession. We stopped being guardians and became thieves. When Adrian asked about Henri and Clara, Willem's face darkened. "They broke the code. There is a balance, Adrian. You don't tip it." That night, Adrian left with a thumb drive his uncle had hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. Inside it were photographs, shipping manifests, names, proof, and a decision. He could bring it all down, but at what cost? Adrian stared at the flickering glow of his desk lamp long after midnight, the thumb drive clutched in his hand like a burning ember. Every document he opened confirmed what he had feared. Centuries of European cultural heritage had been silently bought, sold, and suppressed under the guise of preservation. Shipping manifests bore the names of famous museums alongside anonymous offshore accounts. Crates labeled as restoration materials had in fact contained stolen panels, sculptures, and canvases stripped from Eastern Europe, Italy, even Asia, swapped with expertly crafted forgeries. What made the betrayal more bitter was the presence of federal insignias, discrete stamps that proved the Belgian government, or at least a faction within it, had known and cooperated. One file, marked only Erebus Protocol, included a list of those considered threats to the operation. Both Henri de Settelier and Clara Janssens had been there, as well as a few other names Adrian didn't recognize. Then near the bottom he saw his own. They were already watching him. The following days passed in a haze of paranoia. Adrian wore the same coat, carried no phone, and slept in motels across Flanders, never twice in the same bed. He leaked an anonymous tip to Le Soir, sending them photos of the registry and notes from Clara's files, but the story was quietly buried. He went to a former intelligence contact, Simon Lebeau, a disgraced analyst from the BSR, who now taught criminology in Leuven. After examining the files, Simon confirmed that what Adrian had found was enough to shake several powerful institutions, but warned that exposure might never reach the public. "People don't want the truth, Adrian," Simon said bitterly over cheap whiskey. "They want certainty. And if you take away their trust in museums, in governments, in history itself, what's left?" Adrian's internal compass refused to let him bury it. The final straw came when he returned to his flat in Brussels and found it gutted methodically. No signs of forced entry. Only a note, typed on a typewriter, pinned to the inside of his refrigerator. History is safest in silence. He now knew what Henri and Clara had known, that those behind Knack Glass were not relics of the past, but living entities still operating in the shadows, perfectly camouflaged behind boardroom smiles and cultural grants. Adrian realized the safest course wasn't silence, but speed. He contacted a journalist friend in The Hague, one with no allegiance to Belgian bureaucracy, and arranged a midnight handoff on neutral ground. But before he could get there, Simon Lebeau was found dead in his home. Staged as a suicide, the note beside him simply read, "Forgive the echo." Adrian knew Simon wouldn't have done it himself. The message was coded, an echo, a warning. Fearing for his life, Adrian went underground. He discarded his badge and identity, traveling through lesser-known border routes into Luxembourg, then Germany. His only possession was a microfilm copy of the Erebus files, wrapped in duct tape and sewn into the lining of his coat. He became a ghost, passing silently through the Schengen zone, using only cash, sleeping on trains, always a few steps ahead. When he finally met the journalist, Mira van den Bosch, a Dutch investigative reporter with a reputation for toppling multinational corruption, he was pale, sleep-deprived, but unyielding. He handed her everything. She said nothing for a moment, just nodded, and promised to protect the story. "They'll come after me too," she said. "But maybe they've grown complacent. Maybe they think we still fear the dark." A month passed. Then two. Adrian waited in the German countryside, constantly moving. The silence was unbearable. Had she been caught? Had she been bought off? But then, on a cold March morning, the front page of De Volkskrant changed everything. "Belgian art conspiracy revealed," the headline screamed. Beneath it, names, photos, timelines, and a concise summary of Operation Knack Glass. Though the article stopped short of naming living officials, it exposed the mechanisms, the fraud, the chain of disappearances. International organizations, including UNESCO and Interpol, launched immediate investigations. Embassies issued cold statements. Lawsuits followed. Adrian knew the wheel had turned. But exposure didn't mean victory. Within weeks, Myra's office was broken into. A fellow journalist was detained at Zaventem Airport without explanation. Adrian, too, was no longer safe even in hiding. He crossed into Norway, then Iceland, where he finally found a place remote enough to vanish. There, in a weather-beaten cabin near the sea, he reflected on what it meant to unravel a secret so old, so deeply embedded into national myth. Yes, the world knew now. But many of the culprits walked free, cushioned by wealth, legacy, or diplomatic immunity. Some museums quietly re-evaluated certain pieces, placing vague placards next to suspect paintings. A few were returned. Others simply disappeared into private hands again. There was no cinematic closure, only a cracked system partially revealed, never truly dismantled. Years later, Adrian would hear rumors of another professor in Prague found dead under mysterious circumstances, a gallery fire in Vienna that destroyed undocumented pieces, a new foundation in Zurich opened by an anonymous benefactor with eerie similarities to Knack Glass's past donors. He knew the war wasn't over. Perhaps it never would be. But he had made a fracture, and in that fracture, light could enter. As he watched the northern sky ripple with auroras, Adrian allowed himself, for the first time in years, a flicker of peace. In the end, he had not saved the past, but he had forced the present to see it. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. Snow fell in silent sheets over the rooftops of Minsk, muting the city under a heavy gray sky that hadn't changed in days. The year was 2000, and the capital of Belarus moved with the slow, exhausted rhythm of a country still grappling with the ruins of Soviet collapse. Power was centralized, dissent was dangerous, and secrets, especially those that rattled the gilded gates of the newly powerful, had a way of swallowing men whole. Detective Alexei Morozov was no stranger to such secrets. A veteran investigator with a reputation for unflinching loyalty to truth rather than regime, he was called in only when a problem needed to be solved quietly and completely. That morning, when a senior official in the Ministry of Culture was found dead in his dacha, it was Morozov who stood in the doorway, coat buttoned to his throat, eyes sharp beneath the fur hat, taking in the scene with silent calculation. The body of Oleg Demidov lay half-submerged in a bathtub of ice, wrists slit with surgical precision, and yet no blood tainted the water. The death was meant to scream suicide, but something in the arrangement, the cleanliness, the absence of a note, the presence of an untouched glass of vodka still cold on the counter, told Morozov otherwise. Oleg was a bureaucrat, but not a stupid one. He had survived 3 administrations, was rumored to have access to restricted state archives, and had recently been photographed shaking hands with a Western journalist, an act as suspicious in the eyes of the state as espionage. Morozov knelt beside the tub, lifting a corner of a nearby towel. Beneath it, neatly folded, was a single envelope. No stamp, no address, just 2 words handwritten in looping Cyrillic. Old blood. He slipped the envelope into his coat, careful not to alert the 2 plainclothes agents watching him from the living room. They worked for state security, the KDB, a relic of Soviet-era control mechanisms now reborn under a different acronym, but with the same paranoid soul. Morozov had learned long ago not to antagonize them. Instead, he feigned disinterest. Another weak man, crushed by the system he helped build, he said flatly, and they nodded, satisfied with his compliance. But inside, his mind raced. The phrase old blood had surfaced before, in whispers, in reports buried under bureaucratic rubble, and most recently, in a confidential memo that had arrived on his desk the week prior. It referenced a covert operation dating back to the early 90s, involving missing artworks, erased census records, and the unexplained disappearances of 6 political figures who had once formed part of a transitional committee between the Soviet administration and the new Belarusian state. Demidov, Morozov now realized, had not simply been a bureaucrat. He had been the last remaining member of that forgotten committee. That night, Morozov returned to his apartment on the outskirts of Minsk, a modest 1-bedroom that smelled faintly of old paper and tea. He bolted the door, drew the curtains, and placed the envelope on his desk under a lamp. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a scanned copy of a birth certificate from 1972, belonging to a child named Viktor Hlebovich, an orphan allegedly adopted by a Soviet official. The second was a grainy black and white photo of a gathering in 1991. 6 men in suits, standing before the ruins of the Lenin statue that had once dominated Independence Square. All 6 had been declared dead or missing in the years that followed. Demidov stood at the far left. The third document was a single sheet of government letterhead with a heading that read, Bloodline Protocol, Reintegration Project. The rest of the page had been redacted entirely, with thick black lines suffocating every sentence. A dull knock startled him. He shut off the lamp, gun in hand, and edged toward the door. A voice called softly from the other side, Yelena. It was his sister. He unlatched the bolts. Her face was pale, lips cracked from the cold. They came to my work, she whispered as she entered. Asked about you. Said you were looking into Demidov. Told me not to speak to you. Alexei, what have you gotten yourself into? She glanced at the documents spread across his desk. Her eyes widened. That's Viktor Hlebovich. I knew him. We were in university together. Morozov's breath caught. He's alive? She nodded. He changed his name. Works in the Ministry of Finance now. Quiet. Keeps to himself. People say he's a protege of the Interior Minister. But I always thought he was strange, like he didn't belong in his own skin. Morozov sat back in his chair, the pieces slowly aligning. If Viktor was connected to the reintegration project, and if the project involved the disappearance, or perhaps manipulation, of political identities in the early 1990s, then the implications were profound. Belarus's recent history could be riddled with manufactured lives, false deaths, and orchestrated loyalty. Old blood was not about ancestry, it was about planted power. Viktar might be more than just a bureaucrat. He could be the linchpin of a network built to maintain influence behind the curtain, designed decades ago and still operating under layers of forged identity. He needed proof. The next morning, Morozov visited the National Archive under the guise of a routine inquiry. There, he accessed restricted personnel records, bribing a low-level clerk with a carton of imported cigarettes. In the basement, among boxes stamped with Soviet insignia, he found Viktar's file. The contents had been sanitized, birth records missing, university transcripts faked, service documents incomplete. But tucked behind the manila folder, jammed between pages, was a sliver of microfilm. He pocketed it, heart-hammering. By evening, he had developed the microfilm using an old projection device from his precinct. The images flickered onto his wall, confidential reports dated between 1990 and 1994. They detailed a covert Soviet program to embed loyal operatives under fabricated identities into emerging governments across Eastern Europe after the fall of the USSR. Belarus, newly independent, had been a primary test ground. Operatives were selected as children, indoctrinated, and reintroduced into political life under different names. Viktar Hlebovich had been one of the first. Morozov leaned back, the gravity of what he had uncovered nearly crushing. Belarus's current regime, its laws, its bureaucrats, they might all be compromised. The ghost of empire hadn't died in 1991. It had simply changed its face. Morozov barely slept. Every creak in the stairwell outside his apartment, every hiss of radiators that moaned with age, felt like a signal, an omen. He understood now why Oleg Demidov had died. He had grown careless, nostalgic perhaps, digging into his past or speaking to someone who asked too many questions. Maybe the Western journalist had pushed too hard, and maybe Demidov had handed over a fragment of the truth. Regardless, he had signed his own death certificate the moment he peeled back the veil of the reintegration project. Morozov now faced the same fate, but where Demidov had acted in silence, Morozov had no intention of disappearing quietly. He would make sure someone else knew. Someone outside the reach of Belarus's shadowy inner circle. And he knew exactly who to trust. 2 nights later, he met her at a metro station near the university. Nadine Fischer, a Swiss-Belgian investigative journalist operating under diplomatic credentials, had been covering post-Soviet corruption for half a decade. Morozov had met her once, briefly, during an inquiry into oil contracts. Now, standing at the foot of the Soviet-era escalators with documents stuffed into a thermos flask, he handed her the truth. "This doesn't leave Belarus," he said. "Not until I give the signal. If I disappear, publish everything." She opened the thermos, scanning the papers folded inside, her breath catching at the words bloodline protocol. "Do they know you have this?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet, but soon." What he didn't expect was for the KDB to come for him the next morning. They arrived just before sunrise, 3 unmarked cars, 6 agents in leather coats. Morozov, still dressing, heard the rattle of boots in the hallway. He grabbed his backup drive, jammed it into his shoe, and opened the door before they could break it down. "Don't make this difficult," the agent in front said. "No charges. No warrant. Just an order to come with them." Morozov complied, silent. They drove him not to police headquarters, but to a cold, nondescript government building near Victory Square. The elevator groaned as it ascended 6 floors, the fluorescent light above them flickering like a dying star. Then silence. A single office with dark glass walls. And inside, a man he'd never seen before, until now. "Detective Morozov," the man said without looking up. "You've been busy." He was in his 40s, lean, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit. On his desk sat a folder, thick and creased, marked redacted, Morozov A. The man gestured for him to sit. "My name is Viktar. I believe you've heard of me." Morozov kept his hands on his knees, forcing himself to remain calm. Viktar smiled slightly. "I know what you've uncovered. We've been watching you since you entered Demidov's house." He paused. "The only reason you're still alive is because we're not sure how much you've given away." "I've given everything," Morozov lied, eyeing the corners of the room for exits. Viktar leaned back. "That would be unfortunate, for your sister, for Nadine, for everyone you've spoken to in the past week. But I don't think you're that foolish. You want to know how deep this goes? You think this is about Belarus?" He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a group of men in front of the Reichstag, Berlin, 1992. Among them were at least two faces Morozov recognized, one now a senior figure in the Russian Duma, another a diplomat in Hungary. Viktar tapped the photo. "We're everywhere, Alexei. Not agents. Architects." The post-Soviet collapse wasn't a collapse. It was a redesign. He stood, walking to the window, hands behind his back. There was no room for accidents in the new world. We built stability from chaos. We made deals, created identities, made sure the right people lived and the wrong ones vanished. And for 10 years, we've kept it that way. His voice lowered. "You threaten that." Morozov stood. "You don't scare me." "You should be scared," Viktar replied, still staring out at the snowy cityscape. "Because you're not the hero in this story. You're a liability, and you're out of time." But when Morozov returned to his apartment that evening, astonishingly released without conditions, it was already empty. Everything had been rifled through. The drawers were open. The microfilm machine smashed. And worst of all, a note lay on his bed, handwritten and unsigned. "You have one more move. Make it count." He didn't sleep. Instead, he made a final call. Nadine answered on the second ring. "It's time," he said. "Go global. Leak everything." By noon the next day, an international exposé appeared on a newswire linked to multiple independent outlets. The title read, "The Bloodline Protocol: How Post-Soviet States Were Engineered from the Inside." The article included redacted documents, timelines, identity traces, photographs, and a detailed map of connected officials across Eastern Europe, all stemming from Viktar's forged life and Morozov's stolen evidence. The story spread like wildfire. Embassies scrambled. Protests formed in Warsaw, Prague, Vilnius. Belarusian authorities immediately labeled the report foreign propaganda. Morozov vanished within 48 hours. Some say he escaped through the Polish border using forged papers. Others believe the KGB silenced him and buried the body under a different name. Nadine continued her work, pushing for human rights investigations and independent inquiries. Viktar remained in power, though now under constant scrutiny. But one fact could never be erased: the documents existed. The truth had been seen. In Belarus, the snow eventually melted. The streets of Minsk breathed again in spring, as though nothing had happened. But those who had read the Bloodline Protocol could no longer pretend not to know. They understood now. Sometimes the crime isn't in the killing, but in the forgetting. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In the winter of 2000, Sofia was not the city it pretended to be. Beneath the layers of fresh snow that blanketed the rooftops and softened the edges of the brutalist skyline, the capital of Bulgaria was rotting. The fall of communism had left behind a vacuum, and in that emptiness, monsters had learned to dress like businessmen. On paper, the privatization boom promised prosperity. In reality, it had spawned oligarchs, ex-KGB men, and former militia who carved up the country like a carcass. No one felt this more intimately than Inspector Dimitar Velinov of the Sofia Metropolitan Police, a man who had once believed in justice and now merely tolerated it. It began with a corpse, as it often does. January 17th. The body of a mid-level customs official, Lazar Tenov, was found frozen in the passenger seat of a burned-out Peugeot outside Lyelin, one of the city's grayest residential districts. His hands were bound with plastic cord. His eyes had been removed with surgical precision. A thin trail of blood led from his right ear to his collarbone, congealing in a frozen trickle. Velinov stood over the scene as his colleagues muttered about mafia hits and foreign agents. "No wallet. No ID," his sergeant said. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. But Velinov saw something deeper. This wasn't just another warning. It was a message, and it wasn't for the police. Velinov had been around long enough to know the difference between a killing and a performance. The mutilation, the fire, the location, all of it choreographed. Tenov hadn't been targeted for his position. He'd been sacrificed for what he knew. Days earlier, according to a confidential informant in the Ministry of Finance, Tenov had been preparing to leak a dossier implicating senior officials in a smuggling ring tied to a defunct shipping company, Zvezda Export. Officially liquidated in 1995, Zvezda had become something of a ghost story in Bulgarian criminal folklore, a Cold War relic rumored to have ties to arms deals, human trafficking, and more recently, stolen antiquities bound for Western Europe. But now, it seemed, someone was trying to erase every last thread of its existence. Back at headquarters, Velinov retrieved an old case file. one he'd secretly copied from archives that had been marked for destruction. Inside were photocopies of customs manifests, grainy surveillance photos from 1994, and a single name circled in red, Kirill Stanchev. Former intelligence officer turned businessman, Stanchev was the kind of man who could make ministers disappear and journalists recant their words. In 1997, he had vanished from public life following a corruption scandal that involved 5 deaths and a cargo plane full of agricultural equipment bound for Sierra Leone. Now, whispers in Sofia's criminal underworld suggested he was back, only this time he wasn't hiding. Velenov's only lead was a woman, Tenev's estranged sister Ivana. A librarian by trade, she lived in a crumbling apartment near Vidosha Boulevard, where stray dogs barked through the night and water leaked from rusted pipes. She answered the door with swollen eyes and trembling hands. "They told me not to speak to anyone," she whispered. "But you're not just anyone, are you?" She handed him a crumpled envelope, pulled from beneath a floorboard. Inside was a single cassette tape and a faded photograph of 5 men in military fatigues standing in front of a Zvezda shipping container. One of the men was unmistakably Stanchev. The tape was marked with a single date, January 12, 2000. Velenov had the audio processed in secret. What he heard chilled him to the bone. The tape captured a conversation in broken English and Russian, a negotiation, it seemed, between Tenev and an unnamed buyer. The topics ranged from transit routes to payment methods, but one phrase stood out. "The church bells will cover the final exchange." It was cryptic, yet unmistakable. There was going to be a transfer, likely of stolen goods, and it would happen at a time and place when church bells rang loud enough to mask the sounds of a deal. He spent 3 days combing through logistics records, church calendars, and traffic camera feeds before narrowing it down. The Church of St. Nicholas in Boyana rang its bells every Sunday at noon. It sat beside a defunct train spur and a forgotten loading dock that once serviced the state's agricultural ministry. If anything were to be moved unnoticed, that would be the place. Sunday arrived with gray skies and freezing fog. Velenov, dressed in civilian clothes, parked his unmarked Lada 2 blocks away. He watched as a black van pulled up beside the old depot, its windows tinted, its plates falsified. Moments later, 2 men in parkas emerged from the church, carrying what appeared to be a wooden crate, ornate, gilded, possibly an artifact. Before he could approach, a 3rd man stepped into view. Velenov recognized him immediately. Kirill Stanchev, older now but unmistakable in his arrogance. Velenov called it in, but no response. The radio hissed static. Someone had jammed the signal. He made the choice that would change his life. He went in alone. Gun drawn, he approached the side entrance, using the shadows as cover. Inside, the depot was colder than outside, its windows broken, floors lined with frozen puddles. The sound of the bells rang out, first faintly, then louder, and beneath them, voices. He turned the corner, heart pounding, and raised his weapon. "Police! Drop it!" Stanchev didn't flinch. He turned slowly, like a man who had expected this moment for years. "Inspector Velenov," he said, smiling. "You're just in time." Then everything went black. When Velenov regained consciousness, the cold was the first thing he felt, sharp and biting against the raw skin on his cheek. He was lying face down on the concrete floor of the depot, hands bound behind him with zip ties. Blood had crusted at his temple, where the butt of a rifle had connected. Around him, the echo of footsteps and quiet conversation murmured in the vast hollow of the building. The crate was gone. Stanchev was gone. And Velenov, seasoned as he was, realized he had been played with surgical precision. Not only had the smugglers succeeded in their transfer, but they'd also made certain to send a clear message. Even the city's most relentless investigator was nothing but a pawn. But it wasn't over. Not for Velenov. He stumbled back to his car and radioed for backup, but by the time the forensics team arrived, the place had been scrubbed clean. No fingerprints, no vehicle tracks, no trace of the crate or its contents. Even the security footage from nearby businesses had been mysteriously wiped. It was clear someone with serious resources had orchestrated the job, and worse, someone within the police, or higher, was covering it up. Velenov was ordered to drop the investigation by his superior, Colonel Mitev, who dismissed the operation as a wild hunch turned embarrassment. Mitev's eyes had the vacant, rehearsed gleam of someone who'd rehearsed his denial. Velenov didn't argue. He signed the paperwork. He nodded. Then he began his own investigation, off the books. He started with the photograph. The other men standing beside Stanchev wore no name tags, but one had a distinct tattoo on his forearm, a symbol from the 9th Paratrooper Division, an elite unit disbanded after the Cold War. Through a retired contact in military intelligence, Velinov learned that the man's name was Pavel Banov, dishonorably discharged in 1993 for weapons theft. Since then, Banov had vanished, reportedly operating in Serbia, then moving through the Albanian underworld. Velinov cross-checked airport logs, border manifests, and finally, a hospital record. Pavel Banov had been treated at a private clinic in Sofia just 3 weeks prior. He used a false name, but the blood type matched. So did the tattoo, documented in the intake form. The clinic was run by a plastic surgeon named Dr. Veselin Radev, infamous for reconstructive work on clients with dangerous pasts. When Velinov confronted him in his marble-tiled office, Radev initially denied everything. But once shown a photograph of Tenov's corpse and the missing eyes, his arrogance broke. "I don't know what you think you're chasing," Radev said nervously, "but you're not chasing a man. You're chasing a structure." Radev revealed that Banov had undergone minor facial reconstruction to match the look of a Turkish businessman. He also mentioned a name whispered during the visit, Almaz. It meant diamond in Russian, but Radev was certain it was more than a code name. Velinov's next steps took him into the heart of Sofia's decaying luxury. Velvet-walled casinos and smoke-filled nightclubs where drinks flowed, but words were more dangerous than bullets. Among the city's quiet elite, Almaz was mentioned like a myth, a clandestine auction house for stolen relics, art, and weapons, operated via rotating satellite locations throughout the Balkans. The rumor was that Almaz was holding its next auction somewhere near Plovdiv, under the cover of a historical restoration gala. Velinov borrowed an identity, forged credentials, and attended the gala as Ivan Grigorov, a collector from Bucharest. The event took place in a repurposed Ottoman bathhouse, lavishly restored with chandeliers, armed guards, and wealthy guests in black tie attire. The crates were stacked in the back under red velvet sheets, attended by masked handlers. Each item was introduced by an elegant hostess speaking 6 languages. There were Ottoman sabers, Byzantine icons, even a supposed 1st-century Roman amphora. But then, toward the end of the evening, came a crate marked with Cyrillic letters that made Velinov's stomach twist. Inside was a wooden reliquary encrusted with emeralds, allegedly stolen from a monastery in northern Macedonia. The crowd gasped, but Velinov's focus remained on the man standing behind the crate. Kirill Stanchev, now wearing a diplomat's badge and sipping cognac like a man immune to prosecution. Velinov slipped into a service corridor and made a call to a journalist friend in Sofia, giving her everything: the tapes, the photos, the testimonies. "If I disappear," he told her, "you print it all. Names, dates, everything." But she never got the chance. By the time he returned to his car after the gala, it was already on fire, and 2 men in suits were waiting with suppressed pistols drawn. He dove behind a stone pillar as shots rang out, and in the confusion, escaped into the vineyards. He was injured but alive. Stanchev hadn't wanted him dead. Not yet. That night, Velinov disappeared. Official records show he took an extended leave. His badge was never formally surrendered. But in reality, he slipped underground, becoming a shadow in a city where shadows thrived. The press never ran the story. His journalist friend was arrested on unrelated fraud charges. Colonel Mitev retired weeks later and bought a mansion in Nice. Zvezda Export was never mentioned again. But in the alleyways of Sofia, when police speak in hushed tones about the old days, the name Velinov still surfaces. A warning, or perhaps a promise, that some crimes don't stay buried, and some men don't stop digging. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In the early spring of 2000, Sarajevo was still struggling to catch its breath after years of bloodshed. The war had ended, but its ghosts lingered in the bullet-pocked buildings and whispered through the narrow alleys of Bascarsija. It was in one of these alleys, beneath the soot-streaked facade of a crumbling apartment block, that a body was found, burned beyond recognition, slumped in the rusted trunk of a Soviet-era Zastava. The smell of charred flesh clung to the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Local police, ill-equipped and underfunded, roped off the scene with worn yellow tape, but by noon, the neighborhood was already buzzing with speculation. Some said it was a war criminal finally receiving justice. Others whispered it was a message from the remnants of the mafia that had flourished during the siege. But only one man in Sarajevo knew the truth, or at least enough of it to be afraid. Inspector Dario Vukovic had seen worse. During the war, he'd been a military investigator, the kind of man who found answers amid the ruins of bombed-out hospitals and sniper nests. But peacetime had its own horrors, and this one was wrapped in gasoline fumes and the ugly silence of secrets meant to stay buried. The victim's dental records matched a name he hadn't heard in years, Miralem Kovacevic. Before the war, Kovacevic had been a mid-level accountant with the Sarajevo City Council, bland, unremarkable. But during the conflict, he'd risen like a rat in a flood, helping to smuggle arms, fuel, and black market medicine through embargo lines. He made millions while others starved. And then, when NATO tanks rolled in and the peace accord was signed, Kovacevic vanished. Now he was back, or at least what was left of him. Vukovic stood beside the burned-out car, flipping through an old dossier, one he'd kept hidden long after the war crimes tribunals had gone quiet. Kovacevic had ties to the Vukdina, a paramilitary group that operated out of the mountains near Visegrad. Officially, the group no longer existed. Unofficially, their symbols still appeared like graffiti on walls in certain neighborhoods. A black wolf's head, jaws open, bleeding. Vukovic knew better than to chase ghosts, but something about this felt too deliberate. The burning, the placement, the choice of victim. It wasn't random. He began retracing Kovacevic's steps, digging through immigration logs and border entries. What he found was troubling. Kovacevic had returned to Bosnia under a false name, Milan Zajic, entering from Croatia a month earlier. He'd rented a flat under that alias near Dobrinja, paying cash up front. No job, no relatives, no visitors save one, a man in a black leather coat with a limp and a German accent. Witnesses remembered him because he always left with his gloves on, even in cafes. Vukovic followed the trail to a warehouse near the Sarajevo railway yard, half abandoned but still used by construction crews storing materials for rebuilding contracts. Inside, he found what looked like the shell of a smuggling operation. Crates of stolen medicines, fuel vouchers, and something else, documents bearing NATO stamps and military signatures. Forgeries, perhaps, or worse, stolen originals. He didn't report it. Instead, Vukovic contacted an old friend, Ajla Memic, a journalist at Oslobodanj. She'd covered corruption during the war, and had been threatened more times than she could count. But she still had contacts, former soldiers, mercenaries, even someone in the intelligence bureau who owed her a favor. Within days, they pieced together a theory. Kovacevic had returned not to settle but to silence, to destroy the paper trail of wartime deals that could still destroy the careers of certain men in suits and uniforms. Ajla confirmed the black coat visitor was likely Dieter Weiss, a former BND agent who'd operated under diplomatic cover in the Balkans during the late 1990s. He now ran a consulting firm in Berlin, which was known among insiders to broker information between former Yugoslav operatives and Western defense contractors. Weiss hadn't come to visit an old friend. He'd come to shut one up. But something had gone wrong. Kovacevic had double-crossed him. Perhaps he'd planned to sell the documents to the highest bidder. Perhaps he'd grown paranoid or bold. Either way, he ended up dead, publicly, messily, intentionally. A warning. Vukovic decided to take what little he had to someone who might care. He drove across the city, past mortar-scarred buildings, and into the refurbished heart of Sarajevo, where the international community had established its offices. He requested a private meeting with a liaison from the office of the High Representative, a woman named Claire Renaud. French, meticulous, and trained by Interpol, Renaud was the kind of diplomat who took pride in asking uncomfortable questions. But as he sat in her office and unspooled his story, he could tell something was off. She barely blinked at the mention of NATO documents. Her interest seemed to vanish when he named Weiss. She offered polite thanks and promised to follow up. But when he left the building, 2 unmarked cars were parked across the street. Men in suits watched him from behind tinted glass. He knew then that the rot ran deeper than he thought. That night, he returned home to find his apartment ransacked. Not trashed, searched. Deliberately, surgically. Only one thing was missing: his notebook, the one where he kept his war-era records, contacts, and copies of the forged NATO documents. His instincts screamed at him to disappear. But he wasn't ready to be erased, not yet. Instead, Vukovic called Ajla and told her to meet him at the Eternal Flame Memorial the next morning. "Bring everything," he said. "If I don't show by 10, publish it all. Make sure they can't hide it again." The next morning, the city woke to fog and silence. And by 10 o'clock, only one figure stood by the flame. It wasn't Vukovic. Ajla stood under the drizzling gray sky, her coat damp, the folder in her bag heavier than any story she'd ever carried. She waited, eyes scanning the thinning crowd near the eternal flame, each footstep echoing with unease. Vukovic was never late, not without reason. At precisely 10:17 a.m., a young boy no older than 12 approached her with a folded scrap of paper and no words. He handed it to her and walked away without looking back. She opened it, reading the hasty script she recognized as Dario's. Too close. Don't trust Renault. Meet at the Goat's Bridge at dusk. Come alone. The Goat's Bridge, a narrow, centuries-old stone crossing at the edge of the city, where the mountains swallowed the valley and phone signals died. It was where smugglers once traded goods and, more recently, secrets. Angela felt her breath quicken, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she was now part of. She was no longer reporting a crime, she was inside one. As dusk painted Sarajevo in bruised purples and orange, she walked alone through the forest path toward the bridge. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. When she reached the stone arch, she found Dario there, pale, dirty, and visibly shaken. His lip was split, his knuckles bruised. "They tried to take me," he said hoarsely. "Twice. They think I still have the files." Angela opened her bag, showed him the copies she had made. "I kept the originals in a locker at the central train station. But even if they take them, I have enough to publish." "No," Dario said sharply. "Not yet. We need to break the story right, connect the dots. If we just dump names, they'll deny everything. Call us lunatics. You need to show the chain, how Kovacevic tied into the network, how Weiss connects to the contracts signed after Dayton, how the documents implicate officials still in power." Angela hesitated. "We need more. Real proof. Testimony." Vukovic reached into his coat and pulled out a small tape recorder. "I recorded Weiss 2 nights ago before the fire. I posed as an old contact. He didn't know I was still with the force. He bragged about the cleanup jobs in the Balkans. Called it sterilization." Angela took the recorder. Her hands were shaking now. "This is going to ruin people." "Good," Dario said. "They ruined this country first." But as they turned to leave, a faint click echoed from the trees, metal against stone. They froze. A laser dot flicked onto Angela's shoulder for an instant before vanishing. Then silence. "Move," Dario growled, pulling her down the hillside trail. They scrambled through undergrowth, branches tearing at their clothes. Behind them, a shot cracked through the night. Not a warning. A miss. They didn't stop until they reached a friend's cabin tucked beside a mountain stream. There, in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, Dario called in one last favor, from a contact at the UN mission who owed him his life. Within the hour, a car arrived with diplomatic plates. A woman stepped out, dark skin, hard eyes, British accent. "You're under temporary protection," she said. "But this goes high. Publish or vanish. You can't have both." Angela chose. 2 weeks later, Oslo Bodenge published the story under the headline, "The Wolf's Pact: How War Profiteers Bought Silence with NATO Signatures." It shook the city and the region. Photos of forged documents, the transcript of Weiss's confession, names of mid-level UN officers who signed shady contracts, whispers of war crimes laundering through reconstruction deals. It was enough to spark international outrage, though few arrests followed. Weiss fled Berlin. Renault was quietly transferred. Most officials issued denials. But Angela and Vukovic became targets. They left Sarajevo in the middle of the night, separately, without goodbyes. Angela went to Sweden under temporary journalistic asylum. Dario disappeared into the Balkans, using old war contacts to vanish. The story lived, though. It was picked up by Le Monde, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel. A minor tribunal was formed to investigate post-war corruption in Bosnia. Nothing came of it, on paper. But in dark corners of the former Yugoslavia, the wolves grew quieter. Money stopped moving through certain channels. One by one, old ghosts retired or were made to disappear. The threat of exposure had become a weapon more powerful than bullets. And in the empty locker at Sarajevo Central Station, a single photo remained. A younger Kovacevic standing beside a military truck, shaking hands with a man in NATO fatigues whose name no one dared print. The war had ended, yes, but the crimes had only changed uniforms. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. In the spring of 2000, as Cyprus bloomed under the Mediterranean sun and the island's political tensions simmered just beneath the surface, a body was discovered in a remote olive grove outside the village of Lefkara, known more for its lace-making and cobbled streets than for blood in the soil. The victim, A Greek Cypriot businessman named Andreas Kouros was found face down between two trees, a single bullet to the back of the head, and his hands bound with a silk tie that still smelled faintly of expensive cologne. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, and no motive that anyone would admit to. But in Nicosia, behind the marble walls of the Interior Ministry, whispers began circling with growing urgency. Kouros wasn't just another wealthy man caught in the wrong place. He was an informant, a list maker, a man who had spent the last decade weaving a quiet web between Greek and Turkish Cypriot black market operations, laundering money through construction contracts, and feeding selective information to both sides to keep himself alive. And now he was dead, and both sides were pointing fingers without speaking aloud. Inspector Eleni Savas, one of the few women in her position at the time, was handed the case not because she was trusted, but because she was considered expendable. The political cost of this murder was yet unknown, and no one wanted to bleed on a knife they didn't throw. Eleni drove south to Lefkra with a folder of photos, 2 official reports with more redactions than facts, and a gut-deep sense that the man they'd buried 3 days prior wasn't done speaking. The locals were silent, cordial, careful, the kind of silence that grows thick with old history. When she met with the village Mukhtar, he offered tea and excuses. Kouros owned land here, he said, eyes shifting toward the window where the olive trees swayed. But no one saw him much. His car arrived late that night. Lights off. He must have come alone. But the tire tracks told another story, 2 sets, one heavier and newer, possibly a government-issue sedan. She took photographs and samples and didn't argue. Instead, she walked the property herself, through waist-high weeds and tangled vines, past rusted wire fences and cracked irrigation pipes. The house Kouros had built, unfinished and ghostly, stood at the edge of a slope, overlooking Turkish-controlled territory in the distance. It had no furniture, just a generator and a dusty safe in the master bedroom floor, which local police claimed to have found empty. But Eleni knew safes were like secrets. If it looks empty, you're not looking hard enough. She had it opened professionally. Inside was a single cassette tape, labeled with the word Cap Epsilon Rho Nu Epsilon Iota Alpha, and a handwritten date, March 1999. Back in Nicosia, she played the tape in her apartment, too cautious to trust the precinct. The voice on it was unmistakable, Andreas Kouros, negotiating in Greek, then switching into fluent Turkish. He was arranging the sale of smuggled heroin through Kyrenia's port, bypassing both local customs and the UN buffer zone. The buyer? A Turkish Cypriot colonel. The deal was worth millions, and it had gone through. The implications were staggering. The very idea of a cross-divide drug ring, operated by someone who had the ears of politicians on both sides, would ignite chaos if released. But there was more. Near the end of the tape, Kouros mentioned the ledger, a black notebook containing names, amounts, and dates. A record of every bribe, every payoff, every backroom agreement since 1994. That ledger was now missing. Within 24 hours of retrieving the tape, Eleni's apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, but her furniture was rearranged. Her refrigerator was unplugged. A knife had been left in the sink, blade up, clean but clearly placed. She didn't report it, just made a copy of the tape and mailed it to her cousin in Athens, along with a note. If anything happens to me, give this to journalist Ilias Mouratis. Then she went dark, working only from an unmarked office above a bakery run by her father's old war friend. There, she began reviewing Kouros's financials. He owned shell companies in Famagusta, Limassol, and even one registered in Malta. She tracked transactions routed through Turkish banks, Turkish Cypriot land developers, and several offshore accounts connected to an EU infrastructure initiative. It wasn't just drugs. Kouros had been the central nerve in a post-war crime syndicate that profited off the very peacekeeping mission meant to stabilize the island. Corrupt soldiers, crooked bureaucrats, and real estate moguls, Greek and Turkish alike, had all used Kouros to keep their hands clean while bleeding the country dry. Then came the call. A voice, digitally scrambled, warned her to stop. "We know what you took from the safe," it said. "We know where your father lives. Drop it or we'll bury you beside Kouros, but your death won't be so clean." She didn't sleep that night, but instead of stopping, she reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to in 10 years. Captain Osman Demir, a Turkish Cypriot intelligence officer who had once saved her life during a border clash. They met near the Ledra Street checkpoint under the ruse of sharing information about stolen art. When she handed him a second copy of the tape, he was silent for a long moment, then said, You know this burns everything down, right? You'll make enemies on both sides. I already have, she replied. By week's end, Osman sent her a message. He had located the ledger. It was in a storage unit near Varosha, under surveillance by mercenaries, former Yugoslav soldiers now working freelance security. It was guarded like a war relic. Retrieving it would mean breaking laws, crossing political lines, and risking lives. Eleni didn't hesitate. They moved under cover of darkness, just past 3 a.m., when the buffer zone felt most like a ghost corridor rather than a line of international tension. Eleni and Osman, armed with silence and the kind of desperation only truth-seekers were like second skin, met at a derelict petrol station outside Famagusta. Osman wore civilian clothes, but Eleni could see the military bearing in the way he moved, scanning shadows, calculating distance. The plan was suicidal. Get in, retrieve the ledger, and disappear before the guards noticed. Osman had intel, a shift change at 3:45, one distracted moment when only a single armed man would be watching the entrance to the warehouse. They crept past rusted gates, their steps muffled by gravel and dust. The storage unit was padlocked, but Osman had already prepared. He handed Eleni a skeleton key he'd had custom-made from a smuggled photo of the lock. One twist, and the door creaked open. Inside, rows of forgotten furniture, boxes labeled in Cyrillic, a stack of military radio equipment, and in the corner, wrapped in a canvas tarp, a small fireproof briefcase. The ledger. Eleni's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were hundreds of pages, neatly kept in a ledger book older than Kuros's operations. It contained names of Turkish Cypriot commanders, Greek politicians, mercenaries, drug routes, UN observers turned mules, and dates that reached back to the mid-90s. This wasn't just a ledger, it was an indictment of half the island's elite. Osman peered over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. This, he whispered, is why peace talks never last. They're all making too much money off the chaos. They didn't have time to read more. Footsteps echoed outside. One of the guards had doubled back early. Osman signaled to Eleni to go fast. She slipped the ledger into her coat as the footsteps approached the door. Osman drew a concealed pistol and turned to cover her. "Run," he said, not looking back. She did. She ran harder than she had since her police academy days, slipping through alleys, diving into the back of a vegetable truck just as it pulled out toward Larnaca. She didn't look back, not even when she heard the gunshots crack the early morning air. By the time she made it to Nicosia, her coat was stained with sweat and dirt, the ledger pressed so tightly to her chest it left a bruise. Osman hadn't called. No texts. No coded messages. Nothing. She feared the worst. That night, she stayed in a safe house run by a friend of her late mother, a retired schoolteacher who used to hide pamphlets during the independence movement. Over weak coffee and the distant sound of a radio playing Turkish love songs, Eleni read the ledger page by page. It named senior officials in both the Republic of Cyprus and the unrecognized North. Judges, police chiefs, even a foreign ambassador whose name had surfaced in UN corruption inquiries. These people weren't just taking bribes, they were orchestrating arms deals, using humanitarian aid shipments as cover to smuggle weapons into the Middle East. This ledger was a time bomb. She considered leaking it to the press. But the risks were fatal. Every media outlet was compromised. Every channel would either be shut down or twisted into propaganda. Instead, she typed a summary, a meticulous digital version, and encrypted it using 3-layered keys spread across different physical USBs. She sent one to her cousin in Athens again, another to a friend working as a researcher at The Guardian, and a third she hid in an abandoned church basement where she once played as a child. Then she made a decision that would destroy any future she had in Cyprus. She walked into the Interior Ministry, placed the original ledger on the desk of Deputy Minister Petros Christoforou, and said 5 words that would change everything. "I know you're in here." Christoforou didn't blink. He closed the office door, took off his glasses, and gestured for her to sit. "You've dug too deep, Inspector," he said calmly, almost with admiration. "Do you know how many wars this little book could start?" She didn't answer. He poured himself a drink, one for her too, though she didn't touch it. "You want justice?" he asked. "Justice is a fairy tale, but I can offer you something close, safety. An offshore account, new identity, and in return you give me the ledger, the tape, and everything you haven't told anyone else." Eleni stared at him, saw the smug calculation in his eyes, and realized that even now, with everything laid bare, he thought he could buy her silence. But she wasn't here to bargain. She stood, took the ledger back, and walked out, leaving behind a stunned bureaucrat and a wire she had hidden under her shirt collar, recording everything. That night, Eleni triggered the release of the tapes and copies of the ledger to international agencies and media outlets. Within 48 hours, the scandal broke worldwide. Cyprus was plunged into a political firestorm. Arrests swept through parliament. Military leaders vanished overnight. Osman's name never appeared in the obituaries, but she received a note a week later with a single line. Still breathing. Keep running. Eleni went underground. She never wore a badge again. But sometimes, in a cafe in Lisbon or a back alley in Tbilisi, she'd hear her name whispered, see the headlines in faded print, and know that the silence in the olive grove had finally been broken.